So let's call to order the July 26th meeting of the Planning and Transportation Commission. Could we get a roll call, please?
Chair Alchick, Commissioner Guardias,
Present.
Commissioner Lowing, Commissioner Monk,
Present.
Commissioner Rosenblum,
Present.
Commissioner Suma,
Present.
and Vice Chair Waldfogel.
Present.
We have 5 present, 2 absences.
Okay, no oral communications. Agenda changes. I believe we're postponing item 2. Any other changes?
We're postponing that till August 30th.
That's the only change? Great. Okay, move on to city official reports. We've agendized this as the assistant director's report, but we'll accept a substitute.
Yeah, well, it's my pleasure again. I'm Hillary Gittleman, the planning director. My pleasure to sit in for Jonathan again, who's thankfully coming back from his vacation next week. Anyway, it's a pleasure to be here. As the chair or the acting chair noted, there's one change to the agenda. We're going to do that Stanford Gup traffic discussion August 30th. We had hoped that the county would publish their traffic study in time for tonight, but it didn't happen. So the county planning director has offered to come and give a summary of the methodology and the findings August 30th. And we'll all look forward to that. That's a couple weeks in advance of when the draft EIR is going to be published. The other thing I'd note on the upcoming items on your future agenda, this is packet page 6. There was one other change in addition to adding that item on August 30th. The downtown parking management item that was planned for the next meeting is going to be moving to September 13th. So at your next meeting, we're going to talk about the comp plan again, and we're going to talk about the rail program and the current status of the planning for grade separations. That's really all I have to report this evening.
Great, thank you. Okay, so let's move on to agenda item 3, the public hearing, quasi-judicial for 4157 El Camino Way. I believe there's a short staff report on this?
Correct.
Yes, please.
Good evening to the members of the commission. My name is Philip Brennan. I'm the project planner for this conditional use permit application. As we begin, I'd like to provide just a brief overview of the Hamlet mixed-use development and the pertinent issues as it relates to this application. This is a mixed-use development that was approved in 1983. At the time, it was approved with a prescribed 70 to 30 ground floor office to retail square foot ratio. We know this through correspondence, post-approval correspondence between the zoning administrator and the builder. Construction commenced in May of 1984, and this is important to note because during around that time the city was adopting an ordinance which placed a cap on the maximum amount of office space in the CN zoning district. The developer provided evidence that demonstrated significant construction had taken place prior to the adoption of that ordinance, and as a result, the approved conditions were maintained. Oh, I'm so sorry. I apologize. As a result of that vesting, the excess square footage, which was close to 9,000 square feet of commercial office space, the excess over 5,000, the 5,000 square foot cap was designated legal non-conforming. A bit about the application timeline. The application was submitted in February 2017, requesting a conditional use permit filed by Dr. Kathy Lee, requesting a medical office use for condo units C3 and C4 located at 4157 El Camino Way. The application was reviewed by staff to ensure the applicable zoning codes were complied with. Part of that review included a request from the applicant to provide a parking analysis to ensure that adequate parking provision could accommodate the medical office use. In addition, because this was a medical office use request, the tenant history was requested, and the applicant provided documentation identifying the previous 4 tenants that were concurrently co-occupying this space. They were occupying this space within 12 months, within the previous 12 months, and using the space in a capacity that could be defined as medical office use. As such, staff moved the application forward, and in May, the Director of Planning and Community Environment tentatively approved the CUP request. In June of 2017, the request for hearing was submitted by Mr. Ivan Koshneves. As stated, Mr. Koshneves requested a request for hearing and provided 6 primary points of contention, which I've paraphrased here. Staff reviewed these contentions and responded to them in detail in the staff report. I won't go through every point, but I'll be happy to address any specifics of these points. Many of these points of contention are resolved with just an understanding and application of the existing municipal code in terms of continuance of non-conforming use and the retail preservation ordinance. Others, such as the lack of accessible parking space, is not the responsibility of the applicant because the applicant is not, the scope of work proposed is not increasing the square footage of the unit, nor are they proposing to modify the parking layout, and so they cannot be held responsible for bringing the accessible parking count up to code. That can be addressed at a later date through a separate building permit with the commercial association. The one point we do feel has some merit is point number 6, the medical and dental office ratio exceeding the zoning code. It is true that the existing uses at the hamlet do not meet the prescribed ratio, as the current tenants are utilizing the commercial spaces for non-retail land uses. For many years, the city did not do a good job of record keeping and monitoring the use and occupancy permits over the past 30 years, which has resulted in a commercial complex of predominantly medical and health practices. Because these are individually owned places, or spaces with no record or documentation, identifying which spaces were designated for retail or office use, it's difficult for the city to enforce the prescribed ratio equitably to both the existing tenants and commercial condo owners. The city is trying to resolve this issue fairly through the provisions that are outlined in the municipal code in terms of allowing the continuance of non-conforming uses, prohibiting the conversion of any existing retail to non-retail, and being more vigilant in terms of researching tenant improvement requests and tracking UNO history of commercial spaces. As such, with that said, staff is determined to determine the subject application for medical office use would be consistent with the land use types the suites were previously operating as, and that space had not been vacant for more than 12 months and therefore would not be in conflict with municipal code. As such, staff is recommending the Planning and Transportation Committee the staff is recommending the Planning and Transportation Committee recommend this conditional use permit to the City Council. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Do we have any speaker cards for this?
I did not receive any.
Nothing, any members of the public planning to speak on this? Because this would be the point to do so. Okay. In that case, let's open it up to Commission.
Chair, can I ask for any commissioner disclosures if there are any to be made?
Absolutely. Any commission? No, I don't think anybody is, within the rate. You would have told us if anyone was in the 500-foot radius, correct?
Right, yeah. This would be about, ex parte communications, but if there are none, that's great.
Great. Okay, let's open this up. You want to start, Eric, do you have anything you want to say?
I don't have much. I feel like this one is fairly straightforward and that staff did a good job to answer the concerns of the petitioner for this hearing. So I'm not going to take up more time. If my other fellow commissioners want to have their round, I'm happy to make a motion at the end of that.
Please, Commissioner Suma.
So I do have a few questions. So I appreciate the applicant coming forward and bringing us medical use, which we need places to put medical uses. But I do have kind of a problem with the 30-70 split, and I understand that ratio was lost over the years. And that is something I don't think that it can be explained through grandfathering. And I understand that it might not be possible for staff to go back and investigate it. Though we have had in the past really good historic investigations in the staff reports. My concern is that we also have a very strong need to retain retail in the city. So is there any idea when all these conversions to medical that violated the 30-70 split happened? Or when it became a condo? It seemed like from the letters that staff provided that it was originally for lease built. The whole complex was for lease by the developer. Is that correct?
I believe that's correct.
So do we have any idea when it became a condo? And my concern is the violation of the original condition of approval, which I assume was specific to this development and not a citywide requirement at that time. Is that right?
The prescribed ratio was a condition.
Special condition approval
condition,
for this.
yes.
Okay. Because there's already a lot of medical there, and there's only 555 square feet of retail, so it'd be really nice to get some retail back in, especially since the CN zone is the zone, the little C, as I call them, zones, CS, CC, and CC, that are the most neighborhood-oriented, medical being sort of a secondary use to retail. And also, there was some discussion in the staff report about the difficulty because it's a multi-party owned building, and indeed the whole complex is. But I wonder, I mean, there are many, many, many buildings that are multi-party owned. So I wonder if this sets a precedent that's kind of unusual to me, that if you have more than one owner of a given property or parcel, that it gives you more access to not following the zoning, which in this case is a special condition. And I think that's kind of a difficult thing for me to contemplate becoming a precedent. So those are really my concerns. So do we know when it became condoized?
Well, I'd like to walk back. I may have misspoken. I'm not sure if it was ever as described. You were describing as for lease and then converted to condo.
Well, I think the letter, Exhibit H, maybe, the letter from the developer, says he'll keep the leasing agreement. It's, I forget which. It's Exhibit G, that he'll keep the lease agreement, I think, is where I came up with that.
While Philip is looking up that information, maybe I can hop in on this issue of, just kind of how do you deal with ownership situations? These are, commercial condominiums, so each one are owned by a separate entity. I don't think, first of all, that if we had this project to do over again and approved it today, we would be vague about where the retail was supposed to be and where the commercial was going to be. But in this case, we think the records were vague at the time of approval, and our thought is that it just wouldn't be fair to tell this particular owner who purchased a space that had been in use as medical office that now, because of some record-keeping problem, they couldn't use it for the use that it has been used for when they purchased it.
Right.
So that's why, our recommendation to approve the CUP, and if any of the units ever become vacant for more than 12 months and lose their kind of non-conforming status, then we would have more leverage to ask for the retail use again. But as long as they're kind of in continuous use as medical office, it's hard to, it just wouldn't be fair to the property owner, in this case the commercial condo owner, to force a change in use.
I was thinking maybe I understand there's a commercial condo association. I was thinking maybe the fair thing to do would be to give them an opportunity to discuss how they wanted to handle this in the future. It may have been the case that this didn't come up for years because people didn't apply for CUPs necessarily, which I think has kind of been common. And so maybe this is a question for our attorney. Is this creating a precedent for properties that are owned by multiple parties, which is very common?
Yeah, I think the problem that's created here is a result of the city's, lack of any record. We don't even have the originally approved plans. So I think it's the, lack of records in this case that's creating the issue. And I don't think that we would necessarily be creating a precedent for, any other uses.
But we do have clear records that state there was a condition of approval that was a 30-70% split, with 30% being retail. And I note at this location, what's needed is retail more than medical, especially since there's already, I think, 3 or 4 dental practitioners.
Yeah, again, if we had the project plans and they showed that it was this space that was supposed to be retail, we would be able to force retail at this location. But we don't have an approved set of plans. We don't have anything from the time that this condition was applied that shows that this was one of the spaces that was in the 30%.
Okay, but isn't the whole CN portion zone of this supposed to have that split? That's what I'm not kind of comprehending.
There's 5 buildings that contain ground floor commercial space, which is all located in the CN district. As Hillary was stating, we know the split. What we don't know are which spaces are designated strictly for retail, which were designated for commercial, which is why we're having the problem of trying to resolve this fairly.
And just to clarify, the CN zone has a limit of 5,000 square feet per parcel. It's not a 70-30 split in the CN zone. 70-30 was just the condition, the
It was a condition of approval for this project, the entire project.
Right. I guess I want to clarify also that we don't have records necessarily showing that it was a condition of approval. It was certainly the way that the project was intended to be used when it was constructed. But we don't have the conditions of approval from the approval either.
Thank you. We have one speaker card. Do you mind if I let Mr. Moss? Bob Moss, do you want to come speak on this?
Thank you. It was interested in your comments, so let me give you some history on that site. 40 years ago, there was a commercial area. It was basically a garden shop. And we rezoned it CN with the intent of making it ground floor retail with housing up above. And at that same time, condos were being built along East Meadow between El Camino Way and Wilkie. And so we wanted to have retail to serve those condos, Ventura and Barron Park. When the property was developed, the ground floor was built as a retail site. But retail at that time included medical, not just shops, if you will. And the developer held almost all the properties off the market for over a year. And then he said, oh, I can't rent these to retail. This is a bad area for retail because it's not on El Camino and it doesn't have adequate parking and I can't get people to move in there. So I'm going to put medical in there, put in offices because they're willing to go in there. And that's why we got the medical in. And once the medical went in, it basically eliminated any retail vitality because there were only a few parcels left for retail, and retail businesses weren't going to go in where they were the only one or there were only a couple of others along with them. So that's why it's been in office for almost 40 years. That's where the money was. That's what the developer wanted. And the public had no right, to say, you can't do it, it's your property. So that's why we have offices vertical on the ground floor. Now, in theory, you could prohibit offices from re-entering. An office leaves, you can say, no, retail has to go in there, not an office to replace it. That's in theory. In practice, I think that'd be very difficult to do. You can talk to the legal staff and you can talk to the planning staff and see if they think it's practical. I have my doubts. But that's why we have that facility being used in that way as it is today. The developer did not do what he was supposed to do, and what the public and what originally the Planning Commission and the City Council wanted, which was to have a retail area along El Camino Way. So we're stuck.
Thank you for the historical perspective. Let's move on to Commissioner Monk.
Just briefly, aside from the hearing request from Mr. Koshinevi and from what we just heard from Mr. Moss, I didn't see any other contentions brought up with regard to the CUP. I felt as though all the issues that he brought up in his appeal were sufficiently addressed by the staff, and the analysis that followed addressed all of those concerns. So I would support moving forward with a motion when we're ready to do so.
Thank you. Commissioner Gardias.
Thank you. So just, Mr. Moss, thank you very much for interesting perspective. And by the way, it's always nice to have you here. So what is the plan? Do we have is there a possibility to have a plan to really just regain the retail in there? I know that you may just tell me that this is not the scope of today's meeting, but we should pretty much prospectively think about converting some of that space into retail in the future. Was it a subject of your conversations? And
Yeah, again, anything that's currently in ground floor retail would have to maintain that retail. If one of these spaces were to become vacant for 12 months or more, then also they would lose a non-conforming status, and we could potentially ask for retail. We'd have the same challenge, which is the records aren't super clear about where in the development retail is required, but we would have certainly a better leg to stand on than we do right now after 12
Yes, and this is exactly what you said was in the staff report, right? I was thinking if there is something else, some other perspective that you can offer to us. Maybe we can, when we are working on the comprehensive plan, maybe we can look into this as an example and adjust one of our policy.
I think we all recognize the retail preservation policies we have are very strong. This is a situation where it's really about the property right and the individual ownership of this unit and their expectation that it can continue to be used for the purpose that it's been used most recently. So I'm not sure it's something we could address in the comprehensive plan, but I certainly recognize that the commission, at least a couple of the commissioners, are concerned about this, and we certainly have to do a better job today than we did in the past with documenting spaces that are required to maintain their retail function.
What was the purpose of the construction that was taking place? I don't remember this being explicitly stated in the staff report. I remember reading about this, but I was wondering what work was being conducted without the permit.
Could you clarify what you mean when you're asking what was the purpose of the construction?
What was the scope of the work, of the construction work that was taking place before conditional permit was before the preliminary permit was issued?
Right. They were pouring the subgrade parking garage. Is that?
They were pouring.
They were doing interior work on this unit.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Yeah, they were doing interior. They were doing interior remodeling of the space.
Of that very space that they would be remodeling once we grant them the permit.
Right.
Okay. From the perspective of ADA, would they be required to, with remodeling of the space itself, would they be requiring to comply with the California ADA?
Again, Commissioner, as we indicated in the report, we don't feel like the city can force them to bring the garage up to ADA based on the tenant improvements that are proposed. ADA is a federal law. I think the condo association would be wise to consider that, but we don't feel like it's the city's position at this point to force it.
Yes, you did. I remember reading about this, but I'm asking about the space. The parking garage, it's a different story, but then when they are remodeling the space, it should be still compliant with California ADA.
Absolutely, yes, absolutely.
Okay. So now let's talk about the ADA for the garage, right? So it's the law was enacted by George Bush in 1991. So it's been 26 years. What is the what is the timeline of compliance of those grandfather spaces, parking spaces, to ADA laws? Would they be? Would this association and this collection of separate owners be able to pretty much keep grandfathering the space forever until, let's say, unless somebody brings litigation and sues them for non-compliance based on some accident?
Yeah, I think we could consult with the chief building official on that. I don't know that we have an answer for you on the spot.
Yes, I was asking this being concerned because giving the ownership structure, I can hardly see any changes for this building, either from retail perspective or from compliance with ADA. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's see. So just my comments, I plan to support the CP based on the recent previous use argument. I do want to flag something, maybe echo something that Commissioner Guardias just said, that as we look at code updates, maybe we should look at this as an example of lessons learned. I'm sure that at the time when the permit was originally issued, that the planning officials at that time thought that the requirements were completely clear and that everything was stored in a permanent record somewhere. I'm sure they believe that. And I'm sure that we believe that about everything that we do. But maybe the lesson we should take away is that some of these complicated conditions that require constant monitoring and surveillance and good record keeping may not be great ideas to capture in code. So anyway, I would just like us to take note that maybe there's a lesson to learn here, but my view is I don't want to hold out that lesson as an obstacle for this applicant.
If I can add one thing and just piggyback on that, in the category of best practices, Commissioner Monk noted that we have an error in the record of land use action here in the CEQA finding, and so if the commission is ready to make a motion, we would ask that you forward your recommendation with the direction for us to correct that deficiency in the draft record of land use action.
Great, thank you for the clarification. Anyone ready to make a motion? One further comment?
Very, very quickly, is the appellant not here? Does that affect the status of this hearing at all or not?
No, not unless he actively withdrew the request for hearing.
Okay. And I have one last comment, and that is, my understanding of grandfathering and legal nonconformity is that it had to be legal when built. And so I'm just having a hard time seeing how the commercial portion of this could be the 30-70 split, which is clearly referred to in the letter, how that could be considered legally nonconforming at this time, since there's no proof that it was legal when a law changed. So I just, and that being said, I'm very supportive and do not wish to appear to be not supportive of the dental group that wishes to go in. So I just wanted to make that clear.
Okay, great. Any further comments, or do we have a motion?
Yeah, as far as the changes that need to happen, also at the top it says North California Avenue conditional use, so I don't know if that's appropriate language.
Yeah, we'll do a scrub through the record of
Okay.
land use section, make sure it matches the staff report.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Great. Please.
So I'd like to make a motion that we approve the council's recommendation of the conditional use permit to allow the medical office use for this property.
Second.
Great. Moved and seconded. Any further discussion? All in favor? Aye. Opposed?
Okay.
4-1. Commissioner Suma voting against. Motion carries. Great, thank you. Okay, let's move on to item number 4, public hearing. I'd just like to remind everybody that we have taken up this issue of the office cap several times previously. Tonight we're discussing a short extension to give the council time to sort out what they want to do. That said, if anybody feels strongly about debating it tonight, we can do that. But if we don't, then we can move it along, perhaps move it along quickly. So let's just see what where the sentiment is.
Thank you, Chair Walfogel. Claire Campbell is here to give a brief presentation. This is a public hearing, so we'd invite any public comments after staff's presentation, and then we're interested in any comments from the commission. We're hoping you will recommend adoption of this extension.
Thank you. Good evening, Commissioners. Claire Campbell, Senior Planner. The Planning Commission, as you've just mentioned, has reviewed this annual office ordinance just recently in a study session in March. So since this was relatively recent and for the purposes of managing our time tonight, I'll just provide a very high-level review of the ordinance in my presentation. And I can answer any specific questions you may have afterwards. So the ordinance was adopted in 2015, October 2015, and it applies to 2 fiscal years, 2016 and 2017, and it will expire later this year in November. The interim ordinance affects all office and R&D development within defined areas in the city, and that includes the downtown area, the El Camino corridor, and the California Avenue area. So earlier this year, Council gave direction specifically to staff to prepare a permanent annual office limit ordinance, and this effort was to be separate from the comprehensive plan update. So staff is proposing an extension of the interim ordinance to give staff the time needed to prepare the permanent ordinance and to assure there's no lapse in the regulations. And so currently no changes are being proposed to this existing ordinance. The proposed extension would be for 7 months, with the expiration to coincide with the end of fiscal year 2018. So as mentioned earlier, the Commission did conduct a study session in March where staff received a range of comments on the permanent annual office limit regulations. And your comments will be forwarded to Council in September when they will provide direction to staff on the permanent ordinance. So this slide here gives you an overview of the next steps and general timeline of the office limit. So tonight we're reviewing with you the interim office extension. In September, we're going to go back to Council to review the extension, take action on the extension of the interim ordinance, and then get comments back from them on the permanent ordinance. And then in early spring next year, we're going to come back to you with a draft ordinance for the permanent language. And then shortly after that, in the late spring, we're going to go to council for review of that ordinance. So with all of these efforts, we should be on track to have a permanent ordinance in place no later than June 30th, 2018, when the interim ordinance expires. So this concludes my presentation, and we're available to answer any questions. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. I have 2 speaker cards, so let's go to the public speakers before we move on to commissioner discussion. The 2 are Hamilton Hitchings and Bob Moss. So let's take Mr. Hitchings first.
Good evening. My name is Hamilton Hitchings, and I was one of the members of the Citizen Advisory Committee for the Comprehensive Plan Update, although these comments are my own. In order to reduce greenhouse gases and traffic congestion, the state of California is trying to reduce vehicle miles traveled, and so should Palo Alto. This means placing housing near jobs to reduce and ideally eliminate commutes, thus taking vehicles off the road. Palo Alto has some unique opportunities to do this, such as by building housing targeted for local workers, such as those downtown, at Stanford Research Park, Stanford Hospital, and Stanford. While Palo Alto may not be able to legislate a housing requirement for local workers in many cases, the property owners can indeed restrict them as an incentive to receive permits for zoning extensions. A perfect example could be SRP, which is considering adding housing along El Camino. But if that housing was limited to SRP employees and Stanford employees, not only would it provide more housing, but it would eliminate many commuters and take cars off the road during rush hour. Over the last decade, downtown has added numerous office buildings. I'm not sure the exact count, but I think it's around 20 versus almost no, if not zero, apartment buildings. This is because the profit per square foot is higher for office buildings. It means that every new job added will likely mean a new commuter into Palo Alto for the next 50 to 100 years and possibly beyond that. Thus, we have had an overdevelopment of office buildings and an underdevelopment of new housing downtown. Furthermore, many of these office buildings have been underparked, and the result we now have 1,500 downtown workers parking in nearby residential neighborhoods. Almost no other city in the Bay Area has this. Palo Alto has a 3-to-1 housing to working adult ratio, which is one of the highest in the nation versus Santa Clara's 1-to-1 ratio. That means if we do not build any additional housing for any additional office space for the next 50 years, we would still have a major imbalance and a large number of commuters coming into the city. Every square foot of office space added is one less square foot of housing built. Since the office cap ordinance was put in place, applications for new office development have slowed considerably, and multi-unit housing applications and projects, including housing, have increased. The office cap for Palo Alto, except SRP, is a critical component to addressing our housing shortage and reducing vehicle miles traveled. While I do see the value in a one-year carryover, so projects are not rushed, anything beyond that is just watering it down and reducing housing further and increasing the total vehicle miles traveled daily. Also, the limit needs to be low enough to be material, and I feel that 50,000 square feet is too high when you add in the current exceptions. The misnamed beauty contest portion of the office cap should be called highest quality project selection criteria, rather than first come, first serve that can result in projects with worse parking, traffic, and environmental projects impacts being approved. It has never been used, so has not yet been a significant burden to staff, but should a large amount of new additional office space be requested in a single year, then buildings which have the least parking, traffic, and environmental and neighborhood impacts would be selected. I also believe that when you consider in November, and many of the other folks on the Citizen Advisory Committee also believe this, that the area of coverage for the office cap should be citywide minus SRP. Thus, if you are truly committed to increasing housing and reducing vehicle miles traveled, you will support a meaningful office cap. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the comments. Mr. Moss?
Thank you, Chairman Walthall. First, I agree with the comments of the speaker, and I'd like to elaborate on a few of them. We've had a jobs housing imbalance in Palo Alto for over 40 years. It's ranged from 2.8 to 3 to jobs per housing unit. I went back in my files since 1978, and it's created some really major problems. Currently, one of the problems we have because of state ordinances are that we're being asked to build more housing in order to reduce the jobs housing imbalance. And we have a problem where we're going to fit them in. And then one of the things that people don't want to talk about is the fact that every housing unit costs the city about $2,800 a year more for services than it pays in taxes. So you put in 10,000 more housing units and you increase the city's deficit by about $2.7 million a year. That can be a problem. And that doesn't even attack the problem we have with the schools if you add that many housing units. We're not a school board, so we don't have to address it directly, but it is still an issue, and as citizens we worry about it. So the first thing I'd like to suggest is that we make the cap citywide, not just on specific zones. Second, I think it should be reduced from 50,000 to perhaps 30 or 40,000. Because one of the things that has been happening over the last 10 years is the number of employees crammed into an office has been increasing significantly. Years ago, the rule of thumb was 250 square feet per employee. Currently, it's closer to 100 to 125. And when you have high-cost office space like you do in Palo Alto, which is one of the highest costs per square foot per month in the country, there's a real incentive for the people who are there to cram as many people in as they can because they're paying a lot for the space. That creates traffic problems, parking problems, job housing imbalance problems, and it makes it harder for the city to be successful. So I think it would pay to limit the amount of office space we're allowed to develop in the future. And because if you only limit it to certain areas, I can guarantee you're going to have more offices developed along Bayshore, along Fabian, along San Antonio, because where there isn't a limit, that's where they will build. So the simple, and also it's a lot easier to enforce if it's just citywide. You don't have to worry about, is he putting it in exactly where it's prohibited or limited, or is he one or two parcels over? So simplify it, reduce the amount that's allowed, and take another look at it in a year or two and see what our job housing imbalance looks like then. And if it's not getting better, we should scale it down again. But we have to address this problem. We've been letting it go for decades. We have to stop that, grit our teeth, and make it harder to increase the jobs housing imbalance. We haven't been doing that for years. It's time we did.
Thank you. Thank you. Those are all the speaker cards that I have. Let's move on to commissioner discussion. Commissioner Gardias.
Thank you very much for your report, and thank you very much for the comments. So I understand that today's discussion is going to be about the extension of this ordinance. We discussed this ordinance, it was like over a year ago or so. I remember the comments, I can even cite them.
It's March.
It was March, okay, thank you very much. Yeah, so over a year ago. So personally, I just, first of all, I think that the discussion over the ordinance is off the table today, right? I will reiterate the main point of this, what I said in March, that pretty much I just disagree with the whole notion of the separate ordinance. But I understand it's not the subject of our discussion today. However, I'd like to just make one point. Typically, if we regulate something, it has some other unintended consequences. So my question to the staff is like this: have you observed some other imbalances that would be growing up as a result of this ordinance?
Well, we can certainly go into this when we come back with a recommendation on a permanent ordinance. I think our feeling is that this has been really successful at what it originally intended to do, which was to slow the pace of office development in these 3 areas that are covered by the current ordinance. It has certainly done that. I don't know that there are other unintended consequences. You can give that some thought, but that nothing occurs to me off the top of my head.
Yeah, the question would be, of course, if they are not building offices, what are they building instead? And since we don't have the whole visibility to all the buildings, because it's mainly within ARB purview, I would like to understand this.
Yeah, I think we've seen fewer large applications since this ordinance was adopted than in the couple of years preceding it.
Okay. I rest with this. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Commissioner Monk?
What's the effect if the ordinance expires?
Well, when the clock runs out on the ordinance, any applications we receive would have to be processed without regard to this limit or the time frame that it sets up for our reviews.
Have there been applications received this year?
Yep, we do have, there's a few pending applications that we do have on file. And right now, they're still going through the review, well, there's at least one, and it's going through the review process. So if by March 30th of 2018, well, if it expires in November, then it would just be the standard review process. But if we do an extension, then we would take a look at whatever projects we have in March of next year, and then we would make a determination whether or not we have to go through the additional evaluation for the contest.
Do you expect to have a new ordinance before then, even though this will be in effect until then?
So this existing interim ordinance is due to expire in November of this year. So what we're asking tonight is to extend it from November of this year to June of next year. So that way it'll cover fiscal year 2018.
Right, so when are you going to come back to us or council with the new ordinance?
Yes, so in my timeline that I was explaining, we're going to come back in early spring to the Planning Commission with a draft ordinance, and then soon after that we would go to council for their action on it. So we definitely, our schedule is in line to have everything completed before the expiration of the interim ordinance.
If I can offer one addition to that, which is we had a great conversation with the commission on, sort of pros and cons, what are the options for modifications to this in March. We haven't had that conversation with the council. So when we bring the council this extension, we're going to have that kind of, brainstorming session that will inform development of a draft ordinance, which we'll get to you as soon as we can, probably after the first of the year, and then to the councils, just so we have it in place by the end of the fiscal year.
Thank you for clarifying, and just to confirm that you will be presenting the findings from our March hearing to council, so that we're not rehashing it again tonight, because I was involved with that meeting and did weigh in on it, on my concerns. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Suma?
Thank you to staff for the presentation, and also to members of the public. It's always great to see you, and I really appreciate your comments. So I think since we discussed this at some length so recently, I just want to be very brief, and I wholeheartedly approve the extension. I would be very interested in the council. I would be very interested in looking at reducing the annual limit to make it even more effective, potentially in trying to bring some a better balance of to the jobs housing imbalance. I have always thought it should be citywide, and I like Hamilton's idea of changing the name of the so-called beauty contest, which I think I opined about in March, that it's just kind of embarrassing sounding. I'm not sure highest quality project selection criteria is perfect. It might be a little bit wordy, but I think we should change the name of that. And yeah, so I think those are my comments. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Commissioner Rosenblum.
So I'm in favor of staff's recommendation to extend this until they can give a proper proposal. When we started reviewing this project, though, this proposal, and every time it's come, I've disagreed with the whole ordinance. I think it's a poor ordinance. And specifically, the comment that it's worked because it's just slowed down applications, I don't think is very good. I think the reason why we're concerned about office buildings are the effects of office buildings and the imbalance between housing and office, which is traffic and congestion. And it's a regional problem. I think in using this tool, what you do is put a chilling effect on development of offices. And clearly that's the goal of some people and maybe the goal of this ordinance. But really what we want to work on is reducing the number of people that have to travel by car to their offices. And I think in going for this kind of blunt instrument, we've taken our eye off that ball. I think that's the most important ball. Notably, a lot of the people that are really excited about this ordinance are also against many housing projects. So the same people are not working to say, let's build more housing then as a lever to reduce this imbalance. So I'm skeptical of the goodwill of those that are pushing for this. But the motivations of them doesn't really matter. In the end, it's the effect. And I think what we're doing in this kind of ordinance is we're not getting anything good. We are putting a chilling effect on development. To the extent that you think less development is good, then great, you win. But to the extent that what we really want to do is have a smarter city where we invest in mitigations, so different ways for people to get in and out of town, different ways for people to live and work, then I think we lose. And I think long-term as a community, we do want to invest in better ways of getting in and out, better ways of living. And the last comment I'll make, this came up after we had the Our Palo Alto Summit, which was, as many people here know, an offsite, had 300 plus citizens that gave up their Saturday to discuss this. And this question was specifically asked. How do you want to account for the jobs housing imbalance? What tools would you use to meter growth? And there was 3 choices. There was metering, there was a hard cap, and there was project by project mitigations through TDM measures. And overwhelmingly, the people there had this, what we actually adopted as the worst option. The PTC at that time in discussing it also didn't like this option, but council adopted it because their notion was, I think, that they want to have they want to reduce the number of offices being built. And so as Director Gittleman said, that if that's the intention, then it succeeded. But the will of the citizens that had participated in this process was that we should be smarter about this, and we should come up with ways that individual office projects have to be smarter about the way they handle the impacts. So, long-winded way of saying, I don't like this ordinance. I respect staff's request during this period when we're trying to get the comp plan over the line, et cetera, for more time to have a comprehensive proposal. I think that's completely rational. I also think the concerns of people like Bob Moss and Hamilton Hitchings are completely rational. And in fact, talking about how we address the jobs housing imbalance is one of the challenges we have. I think that this tool does accomplish something, but I think it's the wrong way that we're going about doing this. It's certainly not the smartest thing we could do. So at any rate, I agree with the staff's recommendation for tonight, but I'd like to go on the record again as saying I just don't think this is this is not the smartest thing we could have done around this problem.
Great, thank you. I also plan to support staff's recommendation. I'm not as convinced that this is a terrible tool. I mean, the problem we're in a situation where it's hard to find tools that work. And I think we have to be very pragmatic about finding tools that do actually work on addressing traffic and congestion issues. I mean, I think that we've seen it's very difficult to set up TMAs and TDM in diverse districts. So, we do need to be fairly pragmatic, and I hope that we're considering that as we look at permanent ordinances. I'd also comment that I think it's very hard to tell the direction of causality on the slowdown in office development. It could be caused by this. It could be caused by general economic conditions, secular economic conditions, the election, who knows. It's always very hard to tell. Anyway, I think we should just move on to a motion if we are ready for that. Yes.
I forgot to I have a request, though, in this time that staff is going to take to make their permit recommendation. There was a letter from Nielsen Buchanan, which I admire, around his ask for data collection. I don't agree with the actual data that he's looking to collect, but I think that this time needs to be used for data collection. That prompted me to think, what would I want to see as a commissioner? And there are a couple things I would really like to see. So I would like to see the parking utilization and employee SOV rate at a couple of key locations around town. So in particular, the University Ave core and the California Ave core and Stanford Research Park. And some of this data exists. Some of it probably needs to get collected. I would also like to see, to the extent possible, employee density. Mr. Moss gave some data. He said that employees are now at 100 square feet per employee or 150 square feet per employee. I helped conduct a survey of our company downtown, and we found the opposite. We found actually kind of low density utilization because of our work pattern, where we have a lot of cafes and common spaces, et cetera. And we found that actually our utilization was quite undense, which I think surprised us. Now, I think that staff should actually get this data. And whichever way it goes, I think all of us would breathe a sigh of relief that we're not just making up numbers. So basically, how many people are working in our downtown core per square foot, and then how many of them are using cars? I know that some of this data has been collected in the past, but that should be part of this presentation that goes to us, because I think that then it would help us come to grips with, is new construction adding to this problem? Is it old construction that was underparked? Is it increasing employee density that is causing more of a problem? So I have an ask for data collection as part of our next package, and not just do we want to extend this ordinance or not, but as part of that, it should be a pretty well-constructed data package.
Great, thank you. So we're ready for a motion? You want to make a motion on this?
I can make a
Yeah, please.
Yeah, so agreeing with the whole discussion, and but recognizing the reality and being ready for the comprehensive plan, I'd like to propose a motion to accept staff recommendation and recommend to the City Council adoption, recommend to the City Council extension of this ordinance through the June the 30th of 2018.
Wow. Who's the second?
Doesn't matter.
Commissioner Suma. Let's toss one. Any further discussion? All in favor? Aye. Any opposed?
Sorry, in favor.
5-0 in favor. Thank you. And for Mr. Moss and Mr. Hitchings, thank you for coming, and please come back in the spring when we discuss the permanent ordinance. Okay, are we ready to move on, or should we take 3 minutes, or what do we want to do? Okay, we'll take 3 minutes. Okay, let's move on to item number 4. No, I'm sorry, item number 5. We just finished item number 4. Item number 5, comprehensive plan update, transportation land use elements. Please.
My name is Elaine Costello, and I've been working with the city on the comp plan update. And tonight, as you decided at your July 12th meeting, we shifted around and we're going to work on transportation tonight with the idea that that will give us 3 meetings to work on land use, which has some more complicated issues. So that was a decision of the Planning and Transportation Commission at the last meeting. So we'll work tonight on the transportation element and its implementation table. And then on August 9th, we'll work on goals 1 through 4. We're actually going to, someone asked at the 12th that we advertise goals 1 through 5 in case you really get very efficient and want to be ahead of the game. But I think goals 1 through 4 have some of the most complex issues and on growth management and housing. So I think they will end up taking that meeting. We'll then finish up the rest of the goals at the August 30th meeting. And if you feel that we need an additional meeting, we are kind of tentatively, you mentioned at the last meeting, could kind of tentatively hold August 23rd in case that's needed. And then at the September 13th meeting, we'll do the land use, anything that's left over in land use and the land use section implementation table. And then on the 27th, we'll do the final review and the report to the council on land use and transportation and the final EIR. You will get the final EIR at the beginning of September so that you have a couple of weeks to digest that document. And what the goal of the Planning and Transportation Commission is really given this opportunity to look at the end of a multi-year process, to look at these 2 elements, land use and transportation, starting with transportation tonight, at a really high level, and look at is it really doing a good job of addressing the policy issues? And also identified any changes that would make it more usable to the PTC, because you will be major users of this document. So things that make it more usable to you are very important. We had a meeting, the pre-meeting yesterday, about the logistics for tonight. And what we have is Elena Lee. I forgot to introduce the rest of the staff. Elena Lee from the planning staff is here, of course, Hillary. And Raphael Rios. Okay. Is here from the engineering staff. He's the traffic engineering lead, so that he can give us more background on some of the technical issues in tonight's items. So Elena will take notes as you have a discussion of the transportation element and the issues and concerns that you may have. And then we will take a break, organize those, and what we talked about yesterday was that you will then go through them and discover where there's broad consensus amongst all of you and where there's differences of opinion. And the intent is to forward that as a report, all of your comments organized in that fashion as a report to the City Council. And we will also be sending the entire record of tonight's hearing so that the council has the benefit of everything that's said. So even if they will have everything. So one of the things about this update is it's an update of the 1998 plan, and we have on pages 221 to 224 of your report for tonight a list of issues that we identified at a staff level were where the really major issues and major concerns were and updates as the CAC and the council worked on the transportation element. And there's just a sort of summary of that list up here. If you look at the bottom, I think of page 221 or 220, you'll see it starts with, I think it starts with the list of infrastructure improvements. And that was a way that we tried to help you kind of look at what changed in this element that you would want to consider and what are the big issues. I would say just a couple, to give you a couple of highlights. One of the big changes since the 1998 element is this idea that the 1998 element did talk about reducing the number of single occupancy vehicles. This update has a much more well-developed and robust approach. It notes that you have to involve existing and new residents and existing and new businesses. It has calls for a formalized TDM program with specific percentage reductions, such as 50% reductions in peak hour trips downtown. It has much more on alternative fuel vehicles, shuttles, mobility as a service, trying to bring in all the changes. It's interesting to read the 1998 because it starts talking about encouraging deliveries to home to reduce trips. I don't think we need to do that anymore. There's been a lot of change, and there you can see this. One of the big things in this update was to catch up with the technological changes that have been taking place in transportation since 1998. But also, it tries to also make sure that it was important to not lose what may have been what has proven to many the members of the CAC and the council to be valuable in what Palo Alto has been doing for years, like looking at level of service when it looks at the impacts on new traffic. And the element adds VMT because one of the things that overlays all of this work is much more focus on sustainability and reducing greenhouse gases. So both are incorporated into this element. And that's parking is another example where we, at a staff level, kind of called it poised for change, where the approach in parking is, for example, for new development, to ask that new development continue to meet the standards that are currently in the city's ordinances without using any on-street parking. That was kept in there. There's also language that says, though, as there's evidence that the need for parking is going down, that approach to parking can be changed. So there's this idea that as change has demonstrated that it's effective, there's a willingness in the comp plan to change the traditional approaches. But we didn't just jump in and change them right now. So there's this phased approach to reducing parking requirements over time. And there's also language in there about pricing and charging for parking. That's a big change from 1998. And another big change is a focus on the transit-dependent community. That was not in the 1998 version. There was some discussion of people with special needs, but it was really important to the CAC and the council that the whole transit-dependent community's needs be looked at and that there be policies to meet those needs. So that list is in the staff report, and I hope that it helps you figure out what are the kinds of issues that are in the transportation element and what was the approach to the update to that element. And again, I know there was a question earlier. We did provide some information in the staff report, some additional information that had been requested about the extension of Gang Road and the VMT versus LOS. If you, as members of the Planning and Transportation Commission, have questions and issues you want to make sure we cover in land use, let us know at the end of the meeting. We'll make sure there's some time for that. And because we will be back, our goal is to finish transportation tonight and to start on land use at the next meeting. I did want to add one thing. We are asking you if you have any comments on the implementation table as it applies to transportation, that you also bring those up tonight. So that completes the staff report.
Great. So just to clarify the process, we will discuss items, staff will take notes, we'll take a short break, and then we'll just try to develop, we'll see whether we have consensus, agreement, disagreement about each of the items. So we're not trying to negotiate to,
That's right.
we're not trying to negotiate to a single unified point of view tonight. We're just trying to communicate general sentiment. We do have one speaker card before we move into the commissioner discussion. Mr. Hitchings.
Thank you. My name is Hilton Hitchings. I was a member of the CAC, but these comments are my own. And the focus of these comments is on the transportation element and the challenges and opportunities for transportation that face our city. The transportation element was approved by all members of the CAC, which was a major accomplishment. At a high level, it was not controversial. Getting 20 people in Palo Alto to agree on anything is a small miracle. One of the major challenges with Palo Alto is we have fairly constrained corridors in and out of the city. For example, University Ave between 101 and downtown is not getting any wider. Caltrain is the primary way to improve commuters in and out, but the reality is there are just not that many good opportunities to move commuters in and out of the city. That's why continuing to focus on prioritizing housing for local workers remains important. Besides Caltrains, there's another major opportunity that would immensely benefit SRP, which has a particularly high SOV rate. That is adding a high occupancy lane to Page Mill for carpoolers and buses. You will get significantly higher number of SRP workers carpooling and taking the bus if you reduce their commute time relative to driving alone. While I think improvements to downtown parking, such as a new garage, wayfinding, and elimination of coral zones, are great improvements to parking, I do not support 2-hour paid parking, as it will negatively impact retail businesses, especially for short errands such as dropping off and picking up. And also, it is inconvenient to residents. In general, the transportation element had a lot of thought put into it, was well written, and represents broad community support. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Gwen, just one other point. In our pre-meeting, you had pointed to one of the tables at the back of the packet as a focal point for some of the discussions. Do you want to just say anything about that? Maybe I hope I didn't miss that when your introductory comments.
Let me just, sometimes it's helpful to show. It is what, on pages, it's the list that starts here at the bottom of page 222, which is the major issues and updates that were undertaken by the CAC and the council on transportation. And we put that in there to help guide you to, help facilitate your thinking about the transportation issues and what has changed and, kind of the conceptual basis for the element.
Great. I'm not suggesting that needs to be the focus of our discussion, but this does at least give some key issues to discuss. So let me just open this up now to commissioner comments. Commissioner Gardias, do you want to kick off?
Sure. Thank you very much for presentation and for coming to work with us. Just before I start, I thought that we were going to just do it differently, that we're going to go through each policy and program point by point. So I understand that there is the proposal that was proposed already, but I didn't believe that this was a consensus from our side to do it differently. So it's just from the formal side. I can do it either way. It doesn't matter for me, but I thought that systematically we can go from the top to bottom.
I think it's up to you how you want to tackle this.
Well, yeah, my proposal would be just to go through all the policies and programs, and if somebody could moderate and just to verify if there is opposition or some proposal to change. If there's none, that we can just move on and focus on those that have some comments from the commissioners. At least this is how I approach it, but I can speak either way.
I think it's entirely up to the commission how you would like to organize yourselves.
Yeah, if I can just add, I think it is up to you. Our thought was that the CAC and the council both have already labored on this, that as Elaine indicated, the commission is going to use this document, that you might want to focus on kind of high-level issues, what's most important to you as you review projects and ordinances that come to the commission. If it makes sense for you to go goal by goal, okay, in goal number 1, does anybody have any issues? You can do that, but, we'll leave it up to you. We do want to try and keep this at a higher level and not get into wordsmithing policies and programs.
Very good. Let me just then kick it off. If we need to change, we'll change, right? I don't mind. So I would like to just take your attention to policy L-1.8 on the booklet on the comprehensive plan draft. It's page L28. That's a policy again, L-1.8, which says participate in regional strategies to address the interaction of jobs, housing balance, and transportation issues. It's a new policy.
Excuse me, we're working on transportation tonight, which is T.
Oh, yes, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Yes, you're right. I opened on the wrong page. It's a big loss because this was an interesting comment.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so let me start with the list of the improvements, because from perspective of the transportation element, it's at the beginning of the document. So it talks about different improvements. It's page T-12. There is a list of proposed projects which are here, and one of those caught my attention, and I was hoping that you could clarify this for me. I already gave you a heads up that I will ask this question. It's about pretty much extending Gang Road to extend to Laura Lane, where post office currently has its facilities. I would like to understand how this would be possible.
I'm going to ask Raphael to answer that question. Can we put that overhead up? Thank you. If you just give us a second. Thanks so much, Elena. Oh, I need to do it?
No. I'll take the keyboard and I'll take care of it.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Raphael Reis. I'm a traffic engineering lead. And just to give a little background on this particular improvement, how it would actually be done would need to be analyzed in more detail. But the idea stemmed from mainly the intersection of East Bayshore and Embarcadero Road is one of the most congested in the city, and there's limited room for widening and expansion and mitigation. Even though we've tried to look into various mitigation options for that intersection, a lot of the congestion occurs, for various reasons, including East Bayshore being one of the main entry gateways for East Palo Alto. So there's a lot of traffic coming from the northbound 101 ramp trying to shift over to the left lane and make a quick left onto East Bayshore, oftentimes blocking Embarcadero Road. And then also from the other direction, there's a lot of traffic coming from some of the office areas east of East Bayshore, trying to get to the Dumbarton Bridge or alternative ways parallel to 101. And this was an idea that came up, we thought of at a very high level of a way of maybe eliminating the complicated weave from the freeway ramp to the left turn lane and trying to provide an alternative route to get to East Bay Shore with destinations to East Palo Alto or Dumbarton Bridge, just being really constrained and limited to the amount of mitigation or the possible mitigations for that intersection.
I'm sorry. I understand, but how would you practically do it? I mean, the idea may be interesting to discuss, but pretty much there is a United States Postal Service facility over there. So I don't know how you plan to deal with them. That's number one, and number two is that that gang road pretty much leads to the recreational facilities, which I don't attend myself during the working hours, but there may be some events or some youth that may be training over there. So pretty much just bringing traffic to that area, which is pretty much which is the space of gathering of some sporting teams, of dads and sons that play baseball and runners, you name it. So from my perspective, if you were going just to introduce this bypass, you would maybe address some traffic congestion, which I'm not really sure if you really would, but you would risk pretty much intrusion to this sporting area.
If I can respond to that, I think we tried to make this clear in the staff report. We included this on the list as an idea, but it clearly needs more analysis, and it would require right-of-way acquisition. I mean, there are a lot of issues that we would have to resolve to pursue this as a real proposal. As you know, one of the primary uses of the comprehensive plan is your review of the CIP, the capital improvements, every year in the budget. And so we wanted to at least have a placeholder for this improvement in case the intersection at East Bay Shore just someday gets so bad that we put the time and energy in to analyze this and come up with a solution that looks like this in some way. But I completely take your point. It would need a lot more work. One thing you could recommend, you could include in your recommendation is a policy in the element that goes along with this, just to outline what some of the constraints and issues are that would have to be resolved to pursue this investment. That might be one way to handle your, your anxiety that there's still a lot of issues to resolve here.
Sure. I mean, I think that pretty much I was looking into this from a different perspective, that it just looks so unreal and it's destructive in its form and pretty much just takes away our energy into asking questions about something that may not be real to deliver based on the land ownership and then some other zoning that we have in this area. I'd rather just focus on some other wins just to focus our energy somewhere else.
Well, in terms of our note keeping, why don't we put on our list your comment that you would recommend removing this from the list of investments and maybe an alternative, which would be to leave it on the list but include a policy that has some discussion of all that would be needed to be resolved before this could be implemented.
Yeah, I understand that you're trying to resolve the problem of the traffic congestion at this particular intersection. I totally agree with this because I was stuck there for half an hour just to make a turn, and it's a real problem. So let me now just go to other pages. I'd like to just talk about some other bigger items that should be recognized on this plan, and I'm going to direct you to page T-4, where actually to the map, which is on the page T-5, which is not numbered. So when you look at this conceptually, and I would like to just spend a few minutes on this, that the backbone, transportation backbone today is pretty much is Caltrain and El Camino. And then, of course, there are two other backbones, but those are pretty much the freeways that are outside of the traffic that's going through the town. In terms of this diagram and just larger thinking about transportation element, I would like to propose that we recognize 280 and one-on-one as prospective public transportation lines or the public transportation routes. And then we also recognize that the Page Mill Road from Oregon that extends to Page Mill Road pretty much connects those two proposed backbones as a tie that would allow the commuters to bring commuters from one side of the town to the other side of the town. So, and I can tell you the reason behind this. So the reason is behind is that today there is no public transportation along 280 and 101. It's a private transportation. So if we somehow discuss with the highway authority of allowing public or some other forms of buses to commute and then bring passengers and commuters to some areas like intersection with Page Mill Road or intersection with El Camino, then we pretty much what we can do, we can relieve the areas that are between those two from some other public transportation. We can pretty much add two more public transportation routes on the boundaries of not only our city, but also all other cities. So that's a major proposal they have on the table. So with this, I have a bunch of other ones, but I'd like to just, as an opening, just allow my colleagues to speak further. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. You have more for later?
I have more, but I have to respect your time too. So.
Oh, well, thank you. Okay, Commissioner Monk.
What I've done was basically review the comp plan and come up with several key issues that I just wanted to discuss. The first one would be referring to page T28. And that is the policy regarding shuttle service, ride sharing, first and last mile connections. I think a new policy needs to be developed that would support the introduction of TNCs, which are transportation network companies such as Lyft, Uber, Waze Carpool, etc. We can refer to a policy T1.5 to come up with some language, such as collaborating with or striving to create innovative partnerships that enhance transportation opportunities for first and last mile connections with the goal of reducing traffic demand, or rather parking demand and costs to access University Avenue and Cat Ave, something along those lines. So such a program that would support that is included in T1 13.1. And I would just say that I would support having discounted rates when people are getting dropped off in commercial centers such as University Avenue or near transit. I really like the idea of subsidizing those types of TNC type programs. Next issue is looking at page T33 and goal T2. This one is not really clear to me. I felt the way that this goal was drafted either needs to be more specific or higher level. The way it's written, it's just not completely clear to me. So just wanted to have you reconsider how it's, what the message is of this goal. Looking at the following policy, T2.1, we're talking about the Cities Association for San Mateo County. Why isn't Santa Clara County Cities Association included? Does it need to be? That's our county. Oh, outside our county?
But if it's not
Just to clarify that, VTA is our congestion management association. So that's our alternative that's our version of the San Mateo. CCAG, thank you. Yeah.
So you feel like it's covered? Okay. I saw it written differently in other places, so I wasn't sure if it was covered. And then in regards to the policy to support goal T2, decreasing delaying congestion and VMT, all of that, that's still a little confusing to me. Looking at policy T2.3, I'm imagining this one might lead to some debate here tonight. I understand that LOS is what's familiar and a metric that council wanted us to preserve, but I think the policy needs to be a little more fluid to allow for new trends and the new legislation that's evolving away from the traditional LOS metric and moving more towards the vehicle miles traveled, VMT, which it's also discussed on page T17. I would recommend that this new policy acknowledge that we're in a transition period and to include some sort of a sunset provision for LOS after staff works to apply this new threshold. Following up on that, looking at the next page on policy T2 3.1, which talks about CEQA thresholds, it looks to me that the plan is attempting to kind of circumvent those thresholds by advocating using LOS alongside VMT. According to CEQA, LOS is no longer considered an environmental impact. So I would recommend removing that program or otherwise modifying it.
Yeah, just to clarify, our intention there was not to circumvent the law. I think we all understand that SB 743 means that in the CEQA context, we're going to have to transition to VMT, and the council will have to adopt CEQA significant standards by resolution. We're just saying that when they do that, we think they could also set some policy or parameter about LOS. It wouldn't be for CEQA purposes. It would be for consistency with this program. But I take your point. We could make this more clear.
Okay, thank you. Looking at goal, actually just looking at goal T1 and goal T8, they look a little bit redundant to me when you just read the goals themselves. They're both trying to create sustainable transportation systems aimed at reducing emissions. I know they're slightly different focused, but I would just request looking at those for redundancies. And specifically with regard to goal T8, there are just too many policies there. I would recommend that staff take a look at it and see if it can be tightened up or if any policies can be removed that they find redundant or otherwise inapplicable. Specifically also in that section on policy 8.1, has there been any discussion about possibly reactivation of the Dumbarton Rail Bridge, or is that something that we could advocate to include?
I'm looking to see if it's, I thought it was in here somewhere. I know there's a study.
It talks about the Dumbarton Express service, so I just would like to.
It's T8.8.
It's on page T8.1 where we talk about Dumbarton Express service. So I think a lot of the congestion and parking issues here are because of employees coming in from the East Bay and we're not having sufficient transportation. So if it's possible to look at expanding rail service.
Yeah, I think would direct your attention to policy T8.8. On page T50, this also gets to the
Dumbarton Bridge. Okay.
Issue that Commissioner Gardias raised about transit on the freeways. This policy talks about HOT lanes. That's kind of this idea of making lanes on the freeways usable for transit.
And I appreciated what Commissioner Gardias spoke to on that. If there's a way to move that forward with setting up appropriate meetings or discussions down the road, I would absolutely love to get that going.
Okay. Well, let us make sure that that's reflected on our list of comments here, that you want to look at the Dumbarton Ridge from a rail perspective.
Great. I just want to talk a couple seconds here about the TMA, and I see that it's listed up front on Goal 1 on page T33. Perhaps it's sufficiently covered, and I know that they just received funding, which is terrific. I just wanted to perhaps propose some language that would further protect and expand our TMA. So looking at page T30, hold on, where am I at? T23. So looking at program T12.2 on page T23, at the very bottom it talks about allowing property owners to achieve reductions by contributing to shuttles and programs. I'd like to see after the word programs such as TMA, if that's something that sounds amenable, just to consider that. And then also looking at page T24, kind of along those similar lines. It's in the same program. That's quite a long program. There's a lot of carrots in that program. It's actually the longest program that I've seen. I don't know if organizationally you want to keep it that way, but in any event, it talks about fees collected could be used for capital improvements. So is TMA considered a capital improvement? I don't know if that's, and I know capital improvements would include shuttles and things of that nature already.
Yeah, just for clarification, this program grew out of a mitigation measure in the draft EIR. The idea is to require new developments to reduce their trips through programmatic measures, so TDM plans, contributions to the TMA and the shuttle and the like, and then to require that they pay a fee, an impact fee for any trips that they can't reduce through those programmatic means, and the fee would have to be used for capital improvements, which is not TMA.
Oh, so we can't assign it to anything other than capital improvements? Okay. Thanks for letting me know. Not sure if this is the appropriate time to bring it up, but if our TMA turns out to prove results that are successful, I would like to see it expanded to Cal Ave like it is already mentioned in here, perhaps regionally or to other cities as a model. Might be something to consider with each city bearing its own costs. Now I just have a couple minor things. On page T25, that policy talks about electric vehicle charging infrastructure. Perhaps this isn't necessary, but it's talking about on the two programs that follow on 4.1 and 4.2 about electric vehicle infrastructure requirements. I was going to suggest maybe adding e-bikes or related electric modes of transport, something along those lines. Something with also following plug-in vehicle infrastructure. It might not be necessary, but it looks like there's a policy set for it that covers it, but then the programs are just limited to vehicles that are electric. Might not really make a difference, but just wanted to point that out. So just big picture comment. I understand that a lot of the programs are routine and some are in progress. And so, but even taking those off the table, there's still a lot of programs in here. So if staff could take a look to see if there are any programs that are redundant or otherwise addressed, I would recommend that they do that. I prefer to set this document up for staff to succeed in achieving the programs. And I think if there's less programs or make it more directed, that they'll be more likely that we'll get them accomplished. So what I would propose is that staff might pull out some programs that they think don't need to be, that are already covered elsewhere, don't need to be in here, present this to us and when we revisit this in December, and then we can decide if we want to remove them. So just as a proposal measure. Kind of related, if a program is completed, do we have any processes in place to acknowledge having successfully completed the programs? I think having something like that would be nice to roll out in some capacity if there's accomplishments that are achieved by completing a program. It'd be nice.
Yeah, I think our thought is that every December the commission would review the plan and the implementation programs, and that's the point at which you could say, hey, these have been completed and these need to be reprioritized. These are no longer relevant. You know, that would be your opportunity each year.
It looks like I have one more issue. This one's a little bit more minor as well. So page T38, this has to do with goal T24, that's protecting our local streets. So looking at policy T4.2, it says that we should prioritize traffic calming measures for safety over congestion management. And I'm just a little concerned about how that language can be interpreted by staff. I think it could be problematic. It could lead to a lot of interpretations that might hold staff up on decision making. And I think that, roads are inherently unsafe, and so of course we're going to prioritize safety anyway. I don't know that it needs to be set forth in here, because what it's essentially doing is giving more weight to safety over congestion management. So I would just advise that there be a balance, or that staff would work in partnership with safety and congestion management together. That's it for now. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Commissioner Suma?
So thank you to staff, and thank you, Hamilton, for coming. And I agree with Hamilton that this was sort of, it was a very important element for everyone in the comprehensive plan, but it was one where we had a lot of consensus. So that was very nice. So I was very happy with the version that we forwarded to council, and would, so I think it would have been great if they just had adopted it. But I do think there's some I do think there is some redundancy, having read it over, and I think it is about shuttle programs and last mile stuff, and all of that stuff is really important and good, but I think it exists in like too many places maybe. So I would agree with that. And then at a high level, my disappointment, which is not, like I said, I think it's a pretty good document, but at a high level, in reading it again, I thought there was too much emphasis on the future and not solving the problems we have presently, and not enough weight was given to solving neighborhood parking congestion and neighborhood parking problems and current traffic problems, including current construction problems, traffic construction issues, which I find frustrating. So I wish there had been more of an emphasis on some of those things, and I maybe think that as a whole, it relies too much and emphasizes too much future technologies. I mean, honestly, we have, other than electric cars, we have no idea what's coming down the pike. Could be hyperloops, could be, now I hear today, giant what are they called? Like, no, dirigibles, giant, I forget what it's called. Elon Musk's news thing. But anyway, oh no, Sergey. Anyway, I think we all know about it, but they're like giant dirigibles, but this one is massive. So we really don't know what's coming down the pikes other than electric cars. So I wouldn't want to rely too much on aspirational technology that may never materialize. And once again, I think there's too much. I think there's too much hope that the capacity of Caltrain, once it's electrified, will be able to solve a lot of problems. Once again, I don't think Caltrain has come out very clearly with statements about the capacity increase with electrification, and it seems pretty minimal to me. And once and if high-speed rail comes, there'll also be a diminishment of that, any increase, because of the blended system. And so I'll leave that at that, and then I'll comment on some of my colleagues' comments thus far. So I think the Gang Road thing it's not very clear to me how it would be achieved right now, and I think we have a lot more things that I would prioritize a lot higher than that. I think the idea of trying to have public transportation on state highways is kind of interesting. That being said, 280 is a recognized scenic highway, so I'm not sure what the possibilities are there. I have great hopes for Dumbarton Rail. Let's see. As for discounted rates for Uber and Lyft drivers, I'm not sure about that, and I hope my husband's not watching, but since he works at Uber. But and the reason is because they're still putting cars on the road, and there's a lot of evidence that Uber in San Francisco has increased congestion because more people are opting for single occupancy Ubers and Lyfts. I don't mean to pick on Uber, but what are they called? TNCs. Any of those, people are opting for those rather than public transportation. And when public transportation isn't used, public transportation agencies tend to want to cut the lines. So it's kind of a self-defeating process, I think. Let's see. I think we got a very clear message to retain LOS, both at the CAC and by council. So I wouldn't want to question that. Let's see. That's that. Dumbarton Rail. I would like to see the TMA be successful, and I think for the TMA to be successful, we're going to need a lot more financial support, probably from corporations, and so I would approve of any development kind of fees to support it, and I think we need to monitor it. It's kind of gotten a slow start, unfortunately, I think. And as to the T 2.4, the neighborhood stuff, I think it's really important to retain the notion of having neighborhood streets that are safe and pleasant for children and pets and residents. So I'm in support of that. I'll leave it at that for now.
Great, thank you. Commissioner Rosenblum.
Thanks for preparing this. It's exciting to dig into the comp plan. It's my first of these meetings, so thank you. So I'm going to just also go down the list. First, in the transportation infrastructure investments, I think Gang Road to Laura Lane just isn't like the others, meaning this is a comp plan. It's a bit weird to have a specific road improvement plan as a special point of emphasis in the council's report to us. I mean, the way this should be stated, if you're trying to achieve the goal, is to reduce traffic on East Bayshore, and that this is one of the things that may be considered. Of course, there may be other ways to do that, but it's a bit weird that we have a top line item that is what appears to be a 700-meter cut through behind a baseball field. It just doesn't feel like it's a comp plan item. I had a question around one of these items, which is the full grade separations. So I see for Caltrain crossings, and so this is under policy T-3.15, I think. Pursue grade separations of all rail crossings along the rail corridor as a city priority. So what does this entail? This could be trenching or this could be elevating, but that the city policy is going to be that all Caltrain crossings should be grade separated. Is that correct? Does that understand this? Okay. And so that the program T3.15.1 is that studies will begin for each of these projects. Is that right? Okay. The next section around single occupancy vehicle use. I like the goals that are already established by area. So I do think the key goal is desired SOV rate by section, so I appreciate that being in the plan. The shuttle program, though, I'm sorry, I jumped from SOV to shuttle because it's in the same area and supporting reduction in SOVs. I think should also be subject to specific goals of ridership and frequency. I think it's an area that lends itself well to this. There's a lot of transportation studies that were brought to us when the shuttle program came forward around at what level of frequency do people start to see a shuttle as a reliable option. And so I'm not an expert in this area, but there are a lot of cities that are cited. The Big Blue Bus in Santa Monica is often cited that at some point the frequency of buses reach a tipping point where if you live in Santa Monica, it's an obvious thing to jump on the Big Blue Bus. And we're just not there. It's something that seems to be relevant for school kids, and people have no other option, but it's not something that most people think of as the way to get around Palo Alto. And so I think it would be good to have goals in both ridership and frequency as part of the comp plan, similar to what you've done with the SOV goals. TDM requirements and goals. So I think that there's a couple things that should be around the TMA and TDM. I echo Commissioner Suma's note on we should include a goal for stable funding source for the TMA. As far as the sources for that funding, I'm in favor of everything from development fees to having the fees from our parking programs be funneled into that. But I don't think right now is the time to be prescriptive on this, but I do think that not having mention of the funding sources in our comp plan is a mistake. And we could, tonight, if people want to talk about the preferred funding sources, I suppose that's up for discussion. But I'm just more concerned that the only thing that is mentioned is that it's a nonprofit. It makes it feel like it's not the city's business. Someone else will take care of it. And I want it to be clear that this should really be the city's business. We need to find and help fund this program if it's important. On TDM, we talk about, program T1.2.2, formalize TDM requirements by ordinance, require new developments above a certain size threshold to prepare and implement a TDM plan to meet performance standards. I agree with this language, and I think it's important. However, I also think that we should include a quid pro quo on TDM. I think that developers who do, in good faith, offer aggressive TDM programs should be subject to lower parking requirements. And I would like to see that be part of our comprehensive plan. It's suggested in other parts of the comprehensive plan. For example, that the CAC recognized that over time parking requirements may change, and so there's language in there about periodically evaluating parking needs. But I would like to see this linked to successful TDM implementation on a building level. In terms of the discussion on VMT and LOS, one thing I would like to see, I agree with Commissioner Suma that we're not abandoning LOS, but I'd like to see some of the negative consequences of LOS diminished. And I sent around an article that was sent around to the PTC about the unintended consequences of LOS and what it's happened in terms of making every city just try to maximize car throughput. I would like to see us get rid of the grades, A through F, And we get people here during every meeting that look at LOS, say, now it's an F. Like, how can we be happy with an F? Or Palo Alto, we don't get Fs. Kids don't get Fs. It's unacceptable. And the A through F is fairly arbitrary. It's linked to a number of seconds delay per car. And I think that if we have the number of seconds delay per car, that is sufficient. If people feel like a 10-second delay is unacceptable, then so be it. But I don't think it should be subject to an arbitrary grade that we then link to school performance. For parking, this is more a general comment. I think this is one of those areas, and we had discussed this in the pre-meeting, I'll bring it up now, that lends itself well to a statement of goals. And in general, I think the transportation element could benefit from a good statement of goals. Here's what we're trying to achieve as a city, and here are the changes that we are adopting versus our last comp plan. But this is one in particular I think really does lend itself. So I would suggest that we, as a city, recognize that there's a cost to parking, that as a free good, be it a 2-hour free parking or others, we are incentivizing people to overuse that asset. Second, that as a city, we want to eliminate incentives for overparking. So buildings that build too much parking, and that many cities are now having parking maximums to eliminate incentives or eliminate possibility that we will invest more in parking than other useful things for our city. And third, that where possible, we want to have liquidity for parking, meaning pockets of parking are now, we force every building to park itself. Ideally, we have central resources that can be shared by many buildings. And many other cities and our neighbors have adopted this approach where you have a large shared parking garage. Palo Alto seems to have more than other cities, hodgepodges of bits and pieces, sometimes undersized garages, sometimes scale garages, lots of little garages under buildings that are underused because no one else can use them, no one else can access them. So as a principle 3, I would say liquidity. We want to make it so that we don't have pockets of unused inventory, that we use this valuable asset appropriately. So I'm bringing this up. I realize it's somewhat outside of individual policies and programs, but I think in general, it's easy for people to engage with the principle. If these are the principles that we have, then people can accept them or resist them, but at least we have some principles that can be linked to the specific policies. Those are all of my items on the transportation element. And so at the end, maybe if we want to talk about land use and what we're proposing for the next meeting, I'm happy to discuss that at a second round.
Thank you. Let me just weigh in with a couple of comments, and then we'll, do we have other comments we want to make before we take the break, or?
Go ahead. It's your time for your
Yeah.
comments.
And we have a speaker card. Okay, let me make my comments first, and then I will invite Ms. Elson to come speak. So the word that comes to my mind as I review this is Sisyphean. I mean, that's the effort that we're taking on transportation, and it's endless, and I'm not sure we're going to get there. But my high-level concern with all this is that we're a small village with less than 1% of the regional population, pretending we can have an effective standalone transportation policy. And some of the discussions that I've heard tonight, some of the discussions that are in the policy or that are in the packet, would make sense if they were regional policies, but some of these are just unilateral disarmament if we do them and the rest of the region doesn't. I mean, like some of the discussion about parking. We're in a region that relies on cars. I mean, unfortunately, we have a giant, probably $100 billion deficit in regional transit spending to catch up to have an actual reasonably good regional transit grid. And I think what's also lost here is this is Silicon Valley. We all change jobs every couple of years in Silicon Valley. I mean, I've lived in the same town for 25 years, and over the course of that time, I've worked in just about every town from San Jose to Belmont. I mean, if I were more ambitious, I might go all the way to San Francisco, but that commute looks, to me, has looked untenable. So I think it's really, really hard to build out a local plan, especially for such a small town in the middle of such a big region, that effectively aligns housing and job locations. I just think it's a difficult lift. I mean, it's something you can do on a transitory basis, but it's not something that you can't really get to a long-term stable equilibrium on that, just because of this pattern of people changing jobs, and people basically don't want to move every time they change jobs. They don't want to yank their kids out of school, and it's just the way that people live their lives. We do need effective regional transportation. I don't know how to capture that here because most of that spending, most of that investment is upstream from us. But without that, a lot of these goals turn us into this little island that may or may not be able to function in a self-sufficient way. So I think we should align a lot of our goals with regional transit investments, that as regional transit improves, I know that Caltrain electrification is part of this, but I think that that's just a drop in the bucket. We don't have very good lateral east-west connections. Caltrain takes you to a part of San Francisco, when someday when they build out a little more transit in San Francisco, it may take you to other parts. But I mean, from experience, if I need to get to any other part of San Francisco than what's served by Caltrain, it's a giant project. I mean, the connectivity isn't very good. Connectivity to the East Bay is not very good, and we just have to be cognizant that that is something that won't change. But we should build our plan out around tracking what we can do as that connectivity improves. And honestly, I don't think it'll improve very much between now and 2030. I mean, I just haven't seen the funding lined up, but hey, I'd love to be wrong on that one. I also think that we need to be very rigorous on the transportation element about capturing quality of life and user experience. I think LOS is a tool that, I somewhat agree that the A through F ratings are not as meaningful as they could be. I've heard other people say that delay variances are more significant than absolute delays. So I'm sure there are quality metrics out there, but we do have to capture quality from a local user experience perspective. I'm not sure VMT captures local user experience at all. So I think it's a useful tool for other objectives, but it's not a useful tool for how we as citizens perceive our interaction with, or how we perceive our movement through the transportation network. VMT actually has some other issues. It's interesting. I did a little bit of searching on this. There's actually some evidence that TNCs are increasing VMT rather than reducing it. We're actually tackling greenhouse gases principally through electrification. That's a trend that is here. It's moving along pretty fast. But that said, I will agree with Commissioner Suma. We probably shouldn't build policies around specific technologies because they move so fast. In 1998, hybrids were the hot deal. Electric cars were dead. The Chevy EV1 or something, who killed the electric car. Electric cars are hot now, but in 2030, who knows what'll be hot? It could be fuel cells will be hot, TNCs could be hot. We have no way of knowing today if TNCs will kill private car ownership or if they'll kill transit systems. I've heard people say both. And I think all we can do is really pay attention and figure this out. No one really knows the adoption pace for autonomous. And when it comes, if it comes, when it comes, there is no way to know as of today whether that'll shorten or lengthen average commutes. I've seen some studies that say that when autonomous comes, people will commute farther because it's no effort to get in your handy autonomous car and work while you're driving in from Merced or something, or some really long distance. So again, these are just things that we just don't know. So we have to build out a plan that is somewhat agnostic about technologies, that's somewhat abstract about technologies. The other point I would make is that if we're going to reduce parking requirements on buildings around TMA investment or around other commitments, I completely support that as long as it comes with durable long-term support for those programs. I mean, by durable, I mean like 35 to 50-year durations, because giving somebody a concession in 2020 because they do, that will survive until 2070, just because they're doing something, because they're putting a little bit of money into a program in 2019, 2020, just doesn't seem like a good trade-off. So we need to find programs that match the time frame of the concession to the financial commitments that are being made. Again, we need to track what the trends are, and over time, it may be that we need more parking, it may be that we need less parking. These are somewhat unknowable from where we sit today. To pile onto the Gang Road observation, I think that several people, Commissioner Rosenblum has made this point, several of my colleagues have made the point, but I think that the real principle here is somehow we need to do something at the Embarcadero 101 intersection, and whether we frame that up as reducing traffic or increasing level of service or something like that. That seems like a reasonable policy goal, but sort of taking it down to the level of, this particular thing, might be a little too specific. If somebody came up with, a couple $100 million to build a bridge connector from, Embarcadero, out into, out to the Dumbarton, we'd probably accept that, and I think we'd say that's consistent with the policy. But, again, I don't see anybody with a checkbook in hand for that one today. So anyhow, those are my high-level comments on this element.
Thank you. Excellent comments. And also, same comment to all my colleagues. I think that all the comments are brilliant and very interesting. And so I'm saying this because I don't really see that this is the way of reviewing comprehensive plan. I believe that each of these topics that they mentioned is very important and should be a subject of a separate discussion. For this reason, this discussion should be structured. Otherwise, some value that was offered here by Commissioner Suma, Rosenblum, and others may be lost. And then, or some other value that maybe it's not recognized by others, may be put in some report, but would not be agreed upon by the colleagues. So I still would like to maybe change the tone of the discussion, just either focus on some topic and then pretty much extract the knowledge from these minds, and then have comprehensive picture on variety of items that we were discussing. So that's I'm just after this exchange, I'm just getting to this conclusion that we should really just have this discussion structured a different way. So let me go back to some comments that I started with. So when I was making a suggestion of recognizing 280 and 101 as the transportation lanes, I didn't envision the policy that is on page T50, T-8.8. What I envision the route that has stops and then pretty much allows to transport the commuters from point A to point B, and that point B would be intersection of 280 and Page Mill Road, and then there should be a bus stop there that would allow commuters to change into a shuttle that would be crossing that would be passing over 280 on the bridge of Page Mill Road. That's my perspective, and for this reason, I would argue that the transportation node of Embarcadero and Oregon should be rebuilt, because first of all, it's a loss of land, and then pretty much it would allow to open a bus stop on the other side, on 101 side. And then if we had, I know that this is something not of the short-term value, but if we had something like a policy of this sort, that would maybe stir some ideas at the adjacent municipalities. we all take 280, 101, and we know that others may benefit from the same stops because some municipalities like Redwood City, they have similar situation when there is an overpass of one highway, like for example 92 over 280, which is a perfect place for having a bus stop and then transporting population from Redwood City to Palo Alto to San Jose. So with saying this, so this was the proposal number one. Then also we have other opportunities, of course, of a long term, of a transportational routes, which is the tunneling of the Caltrain, which I think should be in this document. Again, I know this is not the short-term win, but also we should recognize, probably in this document, a policy that we would support BART under El Camino. I strongly believe that there should be BART under El Camino. So with this, I'm going to just go through my idea of just pretty much going from top to bottom. Yes, please.
Well, let me do this. Before we get going on another pass, we have a speaker
Sure,
card.
of course, yes.
Let me invite Ms. Olson to come speak. And then let's maybe just caucus on how we should move through this next round and how that aligns with what we can do effectively over the next hour or so.
Thank you, and good evening. My name is Penny Elson, and I'm speaking as an individual tonight. I just had a couple of comments on some of the goals. Goal T4 talks about protecting neighborhood streets and specifically, but it sort of excludes the residential arterials almost specifically, and in fact, some of those residential arterials are school commute corridors, as we well know. These are sensitive areas, and when it talks about slowing traffic, it really kind of limits that to residential neighborhoods. And in fact, we have some areas on our residential corridors that are heavily used by school commuting children, and the police are unable to enforce for speeds because the 85th percentile speeds are way too high for them to do that. That is a problem we need to solve, and I hope we can get some language in Goal T4 and Policy T4.2 that would address the City of Palo Alto designated school commute corridors. We might draw some of that language from the school commute corridors policy that City Council approved on October 27th, 2003. And then secondly, in program T662, it talks about continuing to provide bicycle education. In fact, there is kind of a lot of people misunderstand that Safe Routes to School is just about bikes. We are all about getting people into all kinds of alternative modes of transportation, and that is a big part of our education program. We start in kindergarten through second grade with pedestrian safety skills, and we start working on bike skills in third grade. So really this should read, continue to provide bike and pedestrian traffic safety skills education for adults and children in the public schools, parks and programs, and the juvenile traffic diversion program. We need to specifically call out pedestrian skills because that's very important, and I don't want to lose that first part of our program that lasts for 3 years. And finally, I just want to comment really briefly. In my interactions with VTA in the last year, I would say that our transit vision is more ambitious than we are ever likely to see happen. We are about to see South Palo Alto Transit significantly cut, and I hope that the maps in the new comp plan will reflect that. It's probably not going to be implemented till spring, but we should probably put that in there. Anyway, thank you very much for your time, and I've heard some interesting comments this evening. Nice work.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the comments. Okay, so let's just check now what we want to do next. I mean, I think there's a couple things we could do. We could, I think that Commissioner Guardia still has some pending, comments on the plan. I think we should allow time for that. Do other people have additional comments or responses, or sort of what do we want to do next? Yeah, go ahead.
So I'd like, with you as acting chair to make the proposal. And yesterday we had a pre-commission meeting, talked about basically this round going forward and each person listing their hot button items. Staff was going to take the opportunity to note those items and consolidate. And then we were going to take a break. And then we were going to come back and see if there's consensus among the commissioners around those items. Which ones do we have consensus that, yes, we'd like to see this done, which ones were split, and if there are any things that we left out. I'm still in favor of that approach. So we already did round one. I think staff would then come back with the full list. So I think this does answer Commissioner Gardias's request to make sure we don't lose any of this, because we will get to see the list and see if it matches our expectation. So I'm personally still in favor of this approach. But again, I would just defer to the chair. Whatever you want to do is probably
So the only nuance I have here is that I think some of us said most of what we wanted to say in round one. I think that some of us deferred it, and I want to just make sure we get everything. We want to get all the round one comments on the table before we take a couple-minute break. So if you have additional comments that you want for round one, or anybody who has them, just raise your hand right now so that we can get those in.
I have a very simple one.
Yes.
I'm fully in agreement with all of the last speaker's comments around. I hope that I could repeat all of them so they make it onto the record. But in order not to repeat them, if there's already a record, then I am in favor of basically every comment. And if you don't have them, I'm happy to repeat point by point.
Yes, Commissioner
Well,
Suma.
I do want to hear the rest of what Commissioner Gardias wants to share, and I also appreciated Ms. Elson's comments, and I also very much appreciated some of Acting Chair Waldfogel's comments, especially since they kind of coincided with mine, but which were much more elegantly put. So, and I would be happy for there not to be, I don't think for what gets transmitted to council, we have to say, oh, there was a majority of us who agreed with something or didn't agree. I think it could just be a list. I don't see why the majority is necessarily relevant. And I'll leave it at that for now.
Great, thank you. Commissioner Gardias, please continue.
Yeah, I mean, actually, I haven't started my comments yet. I just want to make it clear, right, that I just pretty much expressed the overall perspective of this, how the transportation should look like in Palo Alto. But so I will get to my comments, but then the end goal is not clear to me, because we're talking about the list that would be presented to the council. I believe that we're going to present the updated draft. So pretty much the changes that we agree upon of programs and the policies would be, by our vote, would be included in this document. Isn't that right?
Thank you for the opportunity to clarify. We're not proposing to do another version of this document. The idea is to transmit a list of your recommended changes and the issues that you identified to the council.
Just as a point of clarification, and I may ask for some legal backup on this, but my understanding is that our responsibility is, if we choose to transmit a report to the City Council, the contents of the report are not defined by the code. We have no statutory obligation to explicitly review or to transmit an alternate version of the comp plan. But is that an accurate summary of where we are?
Yes, I think that's fair.
Yeah, no, I have this understanding. I'm just not sure pretty much what. I just don't see how without the specific resolutions, how this would be converted into action. Because if council receives the list of our proposals, which will be lengthy and very rich, I don't see the council to debate each point by point, each policy by policy and program by program. I just simply don't see it practically. So I'm not really sure about the value. I mean, I understand if that is pretty much the direction, I can participate in this, but I don't really believe that, that the value we would be proposing would be of some significance.
I guess we'll leave it to the commission about whether you want to take the time to hammer through the list of ideas that you come up with and offer the council-specific motions. That's entirely up to you. If you think that would be the most effective way to communicate what your views on this work product are, or as the acting chair indicated, just simply the list of ideas that have been discussed here and the transcript of your meeting.
Right.
It's up to you.
Let me just, again, my understanding is that we have a series of meetings agendized we have this agendized over a series of meetings. As far as I know, nothing we do tonight needs to be definitive in the recommendation. I think that tonight we collect information. I think if we choose to, there may be a point in this process where we submit some language for a report. I'm not sure tonight needs to be that night, so I don't think you should feel like this is your last chance to weigh in on specific language if you believe that needs to be, that needs to be proposed.
Right, and I understand this, but we had already this discussion that pretty much was, we had 2 months ago about, where we also spoke about the length of the review, which was limited to the 90 days. And we know that the council wants to implement the plan, and we know that pretty much this is the council-led plan as opposed to commission-led plan. That's how it ended up. However, just, if we commit still this 90 days, the input to I would see the more concrete input to the council as opposed to list, even prioritized list. I probably would be looking for some agreement on maybe on the top items that where the consensus would emerge, where we would pretty much say this specific policy would have to change. So then the council would pretty much just go through the list of the policies, would say yes or no. So, but nevertheless, let me just go through my comments. So I'm going to go through the top to bottom, and maybe I will just stop to give other chance to speak. So I'm going to go through from page T22, which is the first goal T1. What I am proposing to include in this language phrase of encouraging small business and home business, and that is something that we discussed with Jonathan at some certain point when we were discussing the ADUs, and it may be controversial today, where pretty much we have a pure residential neighborhoods that by policy are not tainted with home offices. And I'm not talking about the practitioners that pretty much like bookkeepers that do their books and nobody just revisits them. I think that at one point of time there may be a need, maybe in some neighborhoods that are ripe for this opening to allow to some to conduct a home business that would allow for visitors coming to the residence. And that is from why this would be in the transportation element, because it would be one of those policies that would reduce traffic, because those practitioners would not need to commute to the offices, seek for office space, and so forth. So that's one of the proposals. When I go to the next one is policy on page T23, policy T-1.1, which I don't really understand this policy, so pretty much and there are some others that are bracketed as new, and I'm just giving this as an example. Some of those policies, they are not very actionable. So I don't understand pretty much what we would do underneath. So this is just an example of those policies that I don't understand what we pretty much should be doing in response to it. In terms of the TDM, which is the program T1.2.2, on page T24, there is a list of the reduction, of the percentage reduction in the certain areas, and I think that I remember what was that behind this. There was a top level of 30% reduction, overall reduction by TDM. We had this discussion like 2 years ago. I wasn't, or maybe this was about TMA. I don't remember specifically, but the idea behind these percentages was that pretty much there was no scientific calculation behind those reductions. So for this reason, I was questioning those percentages, and specifically I remember TMA that was cited by Mayor Pat Byrd in the press as one of the goals. Today we know that there will be no 30% reduction as of TMA. So I'm just questioning these goals, because if there is no dollars, there is no budget, there is no program to reach those reductions, they pretty much mean nothing. And TMA example was clear, that 30% reduction that just came to us. They put it on the slides, and then it's been a year and a half or 2 years. I think that reduction is zero.
Can I just offer some comments on that? First, this policy that you're citing with the numeric values and on page T24, those are goals that we're suggesting would be applied to private developers who come in and propose new development of a certain size. And these numbers were set in consultation with our traffic engineering team, purposely set to be aggressive but achievable for the different districts that were shown. This is in their best judgment, but knowing what they know about the land uses and the ability to achieve reductions associated with various techniques. So that's where this derives from, and it's not related to the TMA. Then with regard to the TMA, I think it's not accurate to say that they haven't achieved any reductions. They have some pilot programs that are showing very good results. I don't remember offhand whether they're at 8% or, they're not at 30% yet, but they're only really just beginning their work and just getting the kind of funding they're going to need to make a real reduction. I think in the budget for this fiscal year, the council allocated enough that they project they can get to a 14% reduction, so almost halfway to the 30% goal. And I think the intention of the CAC and the council in these policies about the TMA and in kind of highlighting the TMA in this section was really to elevate that as an important program that the city supports and will continue to support in an effort to achieve the goal that they've articulated.
I understand, but I was, and of course those goals are very noble. But if they are not achievable, I rather not have them on paper, because then pretty much this is not becoming. Then this document is becoming unattainable. And that is a problem. So I'd rather just have these goals somewhere in the subsequent plan where they could be revised, but not at this level. If there is truly nothing of the science behind those numbers, I haven't seen the calculations. If this truly manual of the transportation, if the Institute of Transportation Engineers provides the basis for the 50% reduction in the downtown district, I'd like to pretty much see it to really see if that is substantiated. If not, I'd like to just pretty much remove them or somehow put them underneath, so it's not at the policy level. On program T1.23, I think that this commission, it's a new program, and now we're talking about TMA. This commission needs to evaluate really TMA annually. We haven't seen TMA group since at least a year and a half, if I remember correctly. Going to the reducing greenhouse gas emissions, this is on T25. There are some policies about and new programs about, for example, program T1.3.1 to develop an electric vehicle promotion program. That is, I'd like to understand how this differs from the building code. What are we doing? And then I think that 2016 California building code went into effect on January the 1st, if I remember correctly. So what are we doing more than it is required in the code?
This is a program that would call on the city to develop additional programs or strategies to try and get an increase in electric vehicle usage. So it doesn't specify exactly what those programs would be, but I could imagine they could be anything from financial incentives to requirements on existing multifamily housing, any number of other strategies that are not currently in the building code.
Right, but my question is, what additional value above California building code this program would provide? If this program would provide not incremental value, I'm not really sure if that is of a value altogether. I think that pretty much the California regulations are becoming are coming at a fast pace, and they are very restrictive. And then we may be in the catch-up mode after the California building code, not in the forefront with this program.
Can I ask a point of clarification? Is this binding on the utilities department too, the comp plan?
Like all of the implementation programs, I mean, this is something that we hope could be accomplished in the 15-year life of the plan. This one in particular is saying to examine the barriers and opportunities to expand EV use in town.
But might the utilities department take this up as a call to action?
I mean, I think they're already doing it. I mean, I think all departments are already looking at this.
So specifically, there is a California Green Building Standard section of California UBC. And then in terms of this, if we're going to have this program, I'd like to see the note that would allow the private infrastructure to invest in this in the vehicle charging stations. This talks only about the city, and I'd like to see the program that would allow private entities to invest in this charging station. The same, I'm going to in the transit use on page T26. Program, I'd like to direct you to program T1.6.2 that talks about working with Caltrain, Amtrak, and public bus operators to expand bicycle storage and public transit vehicles and so forth. So before Bay Area had started public transportation program, if you remember, there was a network of the privately operated railroads and bus routes as well. So I would like to include in this language word private, to see if we can accommodate any private bus operators.
Do you have many more pages of comments?
Yes.
Sorry, what's the most efficient way to transmit all of this? I mean, in terms of process, I just want to check what is the best process, because I think this is more specific than we necessarily, will be able to develop general opinions on. I mean, would transmitting all of these as an email or memo be a format that we could take on, or continue the topic? I mean, transmit it and then continue the topic. I mean, it's just that I think going through these one by one, I want to make sure all these issues get raised. I want to make sure we do it in a productive way.
We can obviously take them as a written product, but we're not sure whether some issues would be raised that are of interest to, and we can transmit those to the council and they would go as comments. That's fine. That's enough. All these are options for all of you. I think the downside of that, the upside, it's more efficient, which is desirable. The downside is there may be things that are brought up that are of interest to the entire commission.
What if we were to say that we would open this up for these written transmittals that can then get redistributed, and if we were to hold this topic open, I mean, continue it to the next meeting to just finalize if there's any other discussion, so that way we have both a process to feed all this in and a process as a commission to discuss those comments. I'm just looking for a format that gets all the issues on the table, ensures that we all have a chance to comment on it, but doesn't necessarily get us, doesn't necessarily keep us here until midnight.
Oh, we could certainly do that. The only thing I'll note for the commission is the next meeting, we're going to talk about the big sections in land use that some of you have expressed a deep interest in, like all the growth management policies in Goal L1. So, we could certainly do that. If Commissioner Gardias wanted to send us a written list, we could send it back out to the commission in your packet for the next meeting, and then you could quickly, review it and identify any that are of
Let me just take people's temperature on this, whether we'd rather go through this or whether we'd rather just get these transmitted in some other form. No comments?
I'm personally a little torn on this. I don't think this is going in a great direction, because I think what we're going to end up with is a mismatch of a very long list of Commissioner Gardias' specific items matched against some philosophical or more high-level points that were raised by most other commissioners. And I think that it's going to be hard to match them. And so if the intention was to get it all out, then to have a reconciliation process where we go and try to see if there's consensus around individual items, I don't think that that's going to happen by this process. But I also recognize that Commissioner Gardias should have all of his input properly recorded. So I don't know what the right format is for that.
Yeah, and that's exactly, I mean, I want to make sure we capture all this. I want to make sure that as a body we have an opportunity to comment and deliberate on it, but I'm not sure that, I mean, if it's another 5 minutes, I think, great, but if there's a lot of this tonight, the question is, will we be able to effectively deliberate on it tonight?
If I could add just one quick thing. So, Commissioner Gardias, my observation is that you're mixing up two things, which is you're listing your points, but also having a dialogue back and forth with staff, try to convince them of your points. And the listing of your points is like 5% of the EVs. Should you have the ability for charging stations to have private enterprise invest in them? That's a 5-second statement versus the couple of minutes that follows it about the justification and what staff thinks, et cetera. And so my belief is that actually you could get through your list quite efficiently, but you're mixing kind of staff discussion, validation, arguments for with the list. So that's my personal observation, is that there could be a more efficient way of doing it.
Yeah, so let me think how I can adjust. I totally understand it, right? I prepared it in a different way because I was thinking that at the end of the day, Council will get our specific recommendations, and I was concerned with this review to be done at the top level because then we would just burden Council with if they accept list of our observations with rewriting this code if they choose to accept them, those comments. That was so I'd rather just pretty much go through specific policies like this one that you proposed, which I very like, was about the shareability of the parking structure, which I should think that there should be a separate policy added, which is not in the parking section, that would speak that parking infrastructure, the new development, new and existing development of parking infrastructure would be shareable with the public and cross-city parking shareable program, right? So that would be a specific policy I'd like to see being added to this. So let me add. I will think how to capture the comments. Let me add a couple of other ones that I was thinking of. So first of all, I would like to just question the need for the transportation center that we have next to the Cal station. This is the future location of the University 29. And then I think that there is an opportunity to relieve that area of the transportation of the bus parking and loading and offloading, and then commit this area to the housing and retail in the future, and then relocate the transportation transit center somewhere else. So I will probably convey the other comments in writing, or.
I'd like to add on to what you were just referring to in regards to the parking. I agree with your wanting to make a policy there, and when Commissioner Rosenblum put forth the idea of liquidity of parking, I agree that there's probably a lot of parking out there that's not utilized because we don't have access, as you mentioned. I don't know about legal issues in regards to this, but I would like to see some encouragement of technology. I believe there's apps that are the Airbnb for parking. So that's what I'm referring to when I talk about legality and policies of that nature. But this community talks about congestion and parking all the time next to jobs housing ratio. It's like those three things all the time. And what are we doing really about parking? I don't know if it's within the purview of the TMA or not. If it's not, maybe we should consider adding it. Otherwise, I would propose a program could be to put together a community group that could examine innovations in parking solutions and technology. I think some of the apps are called Spotter, Just Park, things like that. I'd also look to non-traditional concrete parking structures. This is a 20-year plan. We don't know what's happening in the future and what developments we're going to have with regard to public transportation and otherwise, and needing to have some flexibility in repurposing the land. So things like automated mechanical parking systems that can maximize parking efficiency, that are also cost savings to the city, and help also reduce environmental impacts, are the types of things that I'd like to see a real emphasis put on, like a real group put together, real policy behind it.
Yeah, so if I may add to this, right? Because it's an interesting thought, and I was hoping that we can have some discussion, because Commissioner Rosenblum had, when he spoke about this, he also had vision that that in the proximity of the transportation centers, If there is a TDM program, successful program implemented, then there should be the owner of the property should be given a bonus of the parking reduction. So I was having opposite thought, and this was based on the reason, but because the public transportation is not picking up after the growth rates of the jobs and housing. At this moment, we really cannot afford to provide the bonuses for the parking because we would deplete ourselves with the space for parking cars that is truly desirable. Even if there is a mitigation of TDM parking, what I would be proposing was to require fully parked facilities, either housing or offices being built, but then decouple the ownership of the housing from the ownership of the parking, and thus pretty much change that, open those structures underneath to the public, and then allow to pretty much to take profit, to take private organizations to profit from either renting or selling those parking spaces. But this would be detached from the parking ownership of the inhabitants of this building.
Yes, Dora?
So I think what you guys are all talking about is in the event that there are underparked residential structures, that if they chose to do so, obviously it would have to be at the buildings. The building would have to be interested in this, that they would be able to let businesses use them, which I think is a great idea, but it's also already happening. The Epiphany Hotel valet parks in, is it called Lytton House, the retirement house? Lytton Gardens. So these things are already happening, and because a lot of times, you know, necessity is one step ahead of planning. So it could be that we need to identify the correct agency to have a little outreach program to see if there's other opportunities like this. So I don't know if it would be the TMA or a city staff person. It's just probably that people haven't thought about it, you know. So I think that's a fine idea. Why waste parking?
And again, I think we're kind of out of line with the original process, but the things I've brought up have been mentioned a couple of times, so I want to clarify. I actually think that the parking plan that the city has pursued for the last couple of years is quite intelligent. So almost there's a three-legged stool around parking supply, parking wayfinding, and residential protections, et cetera, that I think are quite logical. So I actually think the city's made a lot of progress in this regard. The thing that I object to is a structural issue. Because we're concerned with buildings, quote unquote, under parking, we force each of them to fully park. And as a result, what we end up with is this hodgepodge of subscale parking garages that even if you were to unbundle them, which I agree with Commissioner Gardias, they should be unbundled. You should be able to have ownership of a parking space be separate from the unit or an office. And those offices should have to pay for their parking spaces individually. And if a person doesn't have a car, they shouldn't be burdened with the price of a parking space. If I have two cars, I should be able to buy a second one in the apartment building, but that should be my cost to bear. However, what we do as a result of all this is these subscale parking garages, even if unbundled, are really inefficient. So imagine, again, there's been studies of traffic patterns in downtown areas, and a lot of it are people just circling around looking for parking. And when you have these, is what you find is I go into one building that is built for 30 spaces and hope that one or two are unoccupied, and I come out, go to the next one and the next one. And so even if you unbundle, like one thing would be to have a vendor with valet parkers that know where all the buildings are. But again, I think that is a non-obvious solution. The obvious solution is, I think, to prioritize more liquid parking, which is to put the money in lieu fees around scale parking garages that are usable by many companies where possible. and not to prioritize each building having their own private walled garden parking lot. So I think that's a more intelligent thing. And not only that, it's not some fantasy. We see this in Redwood City. We see this in all of our neighbors. It's not unusual to have a combination of paid parking by zone, full-scale parking garages, unbundled parking in buildings, and parking that allows the right ratio that is on-site. There certainly has to be some parking on-site. My second point, though, around reduction for TDM, we tend to make contradictory statements up here. We talk about not having enough funding for TDM programs. And so my suggestion is, where does the funding come from? Well, building parking spaces is incredibly expensive. So every space in Palo Alto we estimate is $60,000. That several projects have come before us and have offered that instead of building 2 extra spaces or instead of building 10 extra spaces, they could supply 30 years, to Commissioner Waldvogel's point, of Caltrain Go passes to every man, woman, and child in the building, so in perpetuity, and they still come out ahead. And so then we can add to our wish list. What else do we want them to give? If they gave a bike to every resident, they'd still come out ahead. If they gave free bike repairs for life to every resident, they still come out ahead. All of their Amazon Fresh orders paid for, they still come out ahead. Like, the fact is, building parking spaces is incredibly expensive, and you can come up with a package of things that compensate for not building those spaces. So my point, Commissioner Gardias, is that when you are in the appropriate place, in exchange for aggressive TDM measures that actually achieve the 30% reduction that you're skeptical of, but many buildings have achieved this, that they should be rewarded by basically having the money available to make those aggressive TDM measures real. Otherwise, there's no incentive for them to do anything. They just fully park the building. We're just going to make them pay more money for parking. And that money could have gone to something good for the city, which is getting rid of our cars. So I want to explain a couple of my comments and why I care about this.
For the record, we're just starting. Okay. May I?
Yes.
Okay. So no, I mean, I totally support that. Pretty much, if there is an aggressive measure of TDM implementation, that building owners should be rewarded with implementing this. So for this reason, I envision that the separation of the either ownership or sub-ownership of the underground parking garage. So pretty much that would allow for separation of the cost and revenue, separation of the profits. That would pretty much allow for separate cost and profit valuation of the building. That would be without the parking cost and the garages separately. That would also allow us to truly assess demand and supply of the parking stalls. Because if there would be a separate ownership of those or some separate management, that would pretty much that would allow us to understand what is true cost of the parking. Is the demand met or it's still there?
I think that there are good points on this. I'm not sure we're going to resolve this tonight. The question is, do we want to capture that there's some disagreement about parking policy? I think that Commissioner Monk do you still have a comment that you want to make before we take a quick break?
Yeah, I don't think we're looking to solve it here and now. I think what we're trying to do is ask council to approve a policy that would enable us to really examine this issue and address it in a meaningful way, because I don't know that that's happening. I think that we're counter to, with all due respect, Vice Chair's comments about us being a small village. Compared to Manhattan we are, but Palo Alto is a world-renowned city, and we're the technology capital of the world. We can come up with a solution to this problem. There's a lot of brain power here and innovation, and I think if there's a team that's dedicated to really looking at this, we can come up with something that will alleviate our parking issues. So I propose to leave it at that for now.
Great. Before I stop for a few minutes so that staff can catch their breaths, just one question for you. Does the comp plan need to touch on any high-speed rail related issues? I'm not sure they're in here. Like, for example, should the comp plan reflect on whether we would want a high-speed rail stop if high-speed rail is built? I mean, are these elements that should be captured or are captured? Just any comments on that?
There is. The plan certainly could include a specific policy or a position on high-speed rail. I think there's something about it in here, and if you
I'm not advocating. I'm just asking whether that's been part of the dialogue up till now.
It has been part of the dialogue. It hasn't gotten to the level of specificity of whether there should be a station here in Palo Alto, but there has been, and there are policies primarily focused on things like collaboration and minimizing any negative impact.
It's just that the council may need to decide whether they need to advocate for that or whether they need to advocate for that to be elsewhere. Anyway, I don't want to discuss that right now. I wanted to ask the question. Why don't we take a few minutes, regroup? Yeah, and then we'll continue after that.
I had one minor addition that I omitted initially, very short. Just referring to the map T1, that has to do with the regional transit connections. We also need to include the relationship to the commercial centers because that's not listed.
Okay, 10 minutes. We just had a discussion. Do you want to just outline the alternative?
Very graciously, Commissioner Walfogel realized that trying to take all the really good comments that have been made and make them into a nice condensed list right now on the fly might be beyond the skill level of the staff and consultants. But so really to kind of pull this together in a useful way, here's what we're thinking of doing. We will take the comments from tonight and we will create a list. We will try and identify the areas that we thought we heard consensus on, and we will bring that list back at the next meeting. Now, in order to make the next meeting, because we see a real advantage to having this come back to you quickly while you remember, not that you wouldn't remember it a month from now, but while it's fresher in your memory, we need to just take what you gave us tonight and put that together and not try and get more from you, not individual written comments or anything. We won't be able to add those and get a staff report out to you for the next meeting. But we will come back at the next meeting. We'll keep the hearing open and we'll continue the item so that you can take a look at the list and you can say, yeah, that captures our comments or not. We'll be we might have missed something. And that captures, yeah, we do feel like we have consensus on the areas, or we don't, and we can go on from there. And then if there are written individual comments that people want to write, I'm not discouraging you from doing that, but they won't get included in this list. You can do that, but it'll be attached because we have to turn this around and get it out on Friday, or get it drafted on Friday into production. So. But feel free to send additional comments. They can be brought up at the next meeting. They just won't be incorporated in this list. Does that capture what we?
I think it does, and I think that it's essentially what we discussed before, with the exception that we're just deferring the collection and production, to give everybody a little more time to do a good job on that. Do we have any? I mean, are there any? Yes.
So I think that Commissioner Gardy has had a lot more comments. So I'm just trying to understand the process. So we're going to continue this. We're going to have a list, and then we're going to have another meeting on transportation. So that additional comments could have equal weight. Is that?
Well, what I'm saying is, if Commissioner Gardias or any other commissioner wants to submit written comments, that's fine. We will send them out. What we're going to use in terms of creating the list where we think there's consensus and where the comments that we already have, something that's going to be of what was discussed tonight. So then when it comes back at the next meeting, you all can take a look at the written comments and say, well, I want to add these too. And every comment that everyone makes, the transcript will be transmitted to the council and any written comments will be transmitted to the council. So we don't discourage written comments. That's fine to do it. It's just that what we're going to try and do, I think Commissioner Walfogel said it, we're going to do what we promised to, what we set out to do. We're just not going to try and do it on the fly tonight. We're going to take what happened tonight and create a set of comments. And then there'll be an additional meeting where transportation will be one of the topics.
Okay, so then the final, whatever is referred to council finally won't be the list from this evening because we haven't completed, but will be the list from the second transportation meeting. Okay.
Right.
And just to that point, I mean, I still encourage, I mean, we still have time, the mics are open. If there are additional issues that anyone would like to raise tonight to get onto the list, I think we can, we can do that.
And I'll just add one thing. I'm
yes,
sorry.
please.
I think we do want to preserve the opportunity to go on to land use at the next meeting. So our hope would be that we could talk about the list that we prepare on transportation, the areas where there are consensus, then any written comments we receive, if the commission wants to give us direction on simply attaching those or merging them somehow, and then have an opportunity to move on to the first set of land use issues, which are big issues.
Right, and I think with all due respect, I mean, we may end up keeping these items open, continuing them, so that we can, we can keep coming back to them. I think as we go through this, there'll be some iteration as we understand more. So we'll kind of see how that process works. It's a discovery.
Well, and just going into this with our eyes wide open, one of the outcomes of continuing this transportation discussion is that your colleagues who were not able to be here this evening will have an opportunity to add their comments. And so this is going to elongate a little what we had thought would be accomplished in one evening. It may be a little more involved, and that's fine.
Right.
Yeah, I think we're learning as we go.
Yeah, I'm just curious, is there a reason why you couldn't just send us the list and ask us to confirm whether or not it's inclusive or if it's missing anything, rather than?
Yeah, that's what we're going to do.
But in advance?
It's just the production of it. It's better to send it all out at the same time.
You mean with our next packet?
Yeah, in the next packet.
And it's also for Brown Act reasons to have the commission's business be done in the meeting in public. And so we can prepare the materials for you to consider, but the actual input from the commissioners as a group would need to come in a meeting like this.
Right.
I've been getting my packets on Friday afternoons. If there's pieces of it, I know you like to give them all to us at once, but I think, are we doing other things other than the land use at the next meeting?
There is another item.
If there's anything you've
agenda.
prepared in advance, if
so
you can.
There are going to be 2 items on your agenda next time. There'll be this discussion of transportation and land use, we hope, and then there's an item on rail.
Okay, well, I mean, I think that this is, we're learning as we go. So, so why don't we continue with the discussions for, with the comments. Commissioner Gardius, do you have more comments that you'd like to add?
Yes, please. So yeah, I tried to just convey to you the bigger ticket items, just to focus on those larger items. So at a couple of weeks ago, at one of our meetings, we talked about Sterling Canal as a possible bike route, and this is under the public ground. So opening this route to the bikers would be desirable in connection to the bridge that we approved a couple of weeks ago over 101. So I would like to add this to the either infrastructure to the list of the most future improvements, and I think that this would be very, very cheap investment that would require more energy as opposed to dollars spent, because there's only one bridge that needs to be built over one of the creeks. Sterling Canal, opening for a bike route. Yes. Okay, so a next item that I would like to just add to this list is pretty much, and we talked about this at the time when we discussed connector, crosstown connector that failed because of different reasons, and then we didn't utilize $1.5 million that was granted to us by I think this was federal or state grant. I think that what we should have a policy to open to pedestrians and to bikers routes along the creeks in Palo Alto. We have 3 creeks plus 1 overflow, which makes 4 of them. Probably opening all of them would not be possible because they are right behind the private properties, and then people may not feel secure if suddenly there would be pedestrian or bicycle traffic behind their fences. But then there are some of them that go through a commercial, or they are adjacent to the commercial properties. And I think that Adobe Creek, if I remember correctly, meets this definition. This is the closest one to Mountain View. So some of these routes may be pretty much readily open after the discussions with the Santa Clara Water District, and pretty much make it available to the public, to the bikers, and it would pretty much create one additional accessibility route. So that is, I would propose that this would become a policy, because this way we would engage with the Santa Clara Water District in negotiation to open those roads, and I think this is the time is to follow the footsteps of other municipalities and make it available to the public where it's really feasible. Another item that I would like to include in these policies would be pretty much requirements of the companies located in Palo Alto to jointly to open their buses to either create a joint TMA program for all the companies in Palo Alto, or open their buses to other companies. I think that there may be. I think that Mountain View has a program like this, where companies, if they have their shuttles that are open to others, to other companies. If not, we should require or at least recommend companies located here to share the transportation that they use for their employees. There may be some liability element because they may have different legal protections of their employees. But then, if they are unutilized buses of Hewlett-Packard or some other corporations, then they may be open to another VMware or some other company that's located here that takes the same route. And then also another comment. I would like to see the program, our Palo Alto shuttle program, being restructured this way so it does not compete with VTA. I don't really know how we affected change of the VTA routes that happened just during the last year, but they were not profitable as they should have been. And when we were adding a line just like a year ago or a year and a half ago, that was partially going along El Camino, I had concerns that it may affect VTA. I think that there are two important transportation corridors for the Valley Transportation Authority, which is Middlefield and also El Camino. And then I think that by having our buses running along those two routes, we affect profitability of VTA. I don't really know anybody. I don't know many that would be taking the bus 35, which I think would become a different number very soon, because our buses, our shuttles are readily available, and you don't have to pay $2. So I think that we should restructure the program we don't compete with VTA. And also, I don't know whose ownership it would be, but I spoke about some private transportation, which I don't know if how possible would be to support, but we should consider to open bus stops for private operators to utilize them. Today, I believe that they are exclusively utilized by VTA. Sometimes I see there are buses that stop at VTA's bus stops that are maybe not licensed. If you recall, there was a discussion in San Francisco because bus operators of Google mainly and Facebook, they were using public bus stops for their purpose. And I believe that this ended up with just sending a bill to those two companies. I think that there is some opportunity to explore if this would allow some to operate and not operate buses that would not be funded by City of Palo Alto. So those were the bigger ticket items that I would recommend. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Additional comments? Anyone else have anything they'd like to add at this point? Is the process, as we've just outlined, is this acceptable to the group?
Well, I wanted to thank the commissioners. These were really, really good comments. I thought we got off to a good start, and we will bring these back to you in a somewhat organized way and identify those where we believe there's consensus for your consideration at the next meeting.
Okay, great. And then just formally, do we need a motion to continue?
No, I don't think we do.
We're just leaving it open with no action taken tonight. Okay, I just want to be sure we're doing the parliamentary right thing. Thank you. Okay, so now I have to find my agenda. I think there's... Thank you, everybody, for the thoughtful comments and the patience.
One more. Can I have one?
Oh, wait a second.
One more. I'm sorry.
one more.
We're still in session.
It's just like Steve Jobs. It's just one more thing.
No, but I remember. No, sorry guys, I have no iPhone to reveal. But I remember when we talked with Adrian here about policy to align bike routes with as a policy at the policy level with the sidewalks. And if you remember, we had different designs of different streets where bike routes were proposed in the middle of the street, like it is in San Francisco. So we had a discussion, and Adrian agreed with me that pretty much we should not pursue this design that San Francisco has because it just it creates risk of collision of the bicyclists and the cars. So as a matter of the policy, there should be a policy that would require that all bike routes are aligned with the sidewalks. And maybe in the future, like for example in Netherlands, they would be incorporated into a sidewalk where bikes are separated with a curb or some other hard element, like by Jordan, from the traffic. Thank you.
Feel free to submit more in writing, because we're leaving this open. Okay, item number 6. Moving on. Gone on item number 5. Item number 6, approval of minutes. We have a motion.
I move that we approve the minutes from the June 28th meeting.
Okay.
Second.
Yeah. Moved and yes. Any amendments, changes, revisions? All in favor? Aye. Aye. Opposed? Minutes pass. We don't have any open committees. Commissioner questions, comments, announcements. Feel free to add.
One announcement, I don't know, it went to the commission, I believe, but basically what I understand is that Samtrans is releasing results on their study of the Dumbarton Corridor transit options, and as it relates to the congestion here in Palo Alto, something that we should be looking to review at some point. I'm understanding that it's going to be held on August 2nd at 2 p.m. I don't know where, but there was an email that was sent to all of us, I believe. So I think that's something we need to make sure we pay attention to. I thought there was also an agenda item on things we want to make sure that are covered on the land use section. Was that part of our agenda tonight?
It was part of this.
So I would recommend submitting that, and I mean, since we continued that item, you can submit that. You can submit that via email.
Yeah, if we could, if it's okay for staff that we submit our suggestions on covered areas for land use by email, then I think that would be a good format. Is that appropriate?
I mean, what do we mean the next day? You know, we're happy to get your suggestions. Again, we're trying to get this report pulled together by the end of the week, so we really need them tomorrow.
There was an agenda item.
Okay, any other commissioner questions, comments, announcements? In that case, the meeting is adjourned, and the next meeting is, what is it, August 9th?
The draft. Was that a mistake?
No, it was part of the last item.